Welcome to our tour through the geography of absurdity, where the map stops being a tool of order and turns into evidence in a case about a crime against common sense. There won't be any volcanoes, jungles, or pompous views that travel brochures usually promise, with an overly happy family on the cover. Our landmarks are humbler and stranger. A white line on a sidewalk, a sign by a door, someone else's tax jurisdiction in your bedroom, a state border that acts like a cat who's decided to walk exactly where it shouldn't. If you enjoy exploring the world from your couch and appreciate quality content, support this series with a like. Drop a comment telling us which of these borders seems the most absurd to you. That'll inspire us to map out new, strange routes. Story number 1. Barla Hertog and Barla Nassau. The border that walked into your house without knocking. At first glance, Barla isn't a place so much as a postcard someone forgot to sign. Quiet brick houses, the low sky of Brabant, neat shutters, bicycles, dogs with the look of minor municipal officials, a cafe where the coffee smells like it was brewed not for energy, but for reconciling two nations. The street goes along quietly, without dramatic gorges, without barbed wire, without searchlights cutting through the fog. No sense at all that you're approaching one of the strangest border spectacles on earth. No stone-faced border guard. No barrier that creaks like old props from a Cold War film. Just cobblestones, a bakery window, and white crosses underfoot. So modest, as though they were drawn by a janitor dabbling in geopolitics after his third cup of coffee. And right here the tourist freezes for the first time, because the white crosses aren't decorations. They're not a decorative whim of urban planners or an art project on the theme of European identity. They're a genuine international border between Belgium and the Netherlands, marked directly on streets, sidewalks, building facades, shops, kitchens, and, if local pride is to be believed, even bedrooms. The official tourist resource for Barl describes this pair of municipalities as a complex of 30 enclaves, Belgian pieces of territory surrounded by Dutch land. And inside some Belgian pieces, Dutch islands are hidden, like a Matryoshka doll assembled by someone who, on principle, refused to believe in simple solutions. Barla Hertog is the Belgian part, Barla Nassau the Dutch. But don't expect one to lie on the left and the other on the right, like well-behaved countries on a school map. No, here they occupy the same physical space, like two neighbors who decided to live in one apartment but each kept their own tax office, police station, town hall, postal habits, and flag. One house may be Belgian, the neighbor's Dutch, the next one Belgian again. And around the corner, the border suddenly makes such a turn that it seems like it remembered it left the iron on at home. According to local descriptions, the village genuinely operates as two municipal worlds layered on top of each other. Different administrations, different services, different legal details, which is exactly what real sovereignty is made of. The main rule of Barla sounds almost comical. The nationality of a house is often determined by its front door. Not by where the kitchen is, not by where the owner sleeps, not by where the cat asserts its rights to the sofa. By the door. If the door opens onto the Belgian side, welcome to Belgium. If onto the Dutch side, please enjoy the Netherlands. Signs with the colors of the respective state hang near entrances. And this looks like a children's game, until you realize that behind this game stand taxes, documents, mail, police, and a whole crowd of small bureaucratic demons who feed on paperwork. The Barla Heritage Society makes it clear. The jurisdiction of residents is determined by the location of their front door, and a sign on the house tells you which legal universe you're entering. There's something Kafkaesque about this, as if Kafka had one day stopped writing novels and taken a job as a cadastral engineer. Imagine heading out in the morning for bread, crossing an international border at your own flower bed, buying a croissant in one country, taking a few steps, and already potentially violating parking regulations in another. In a film, this would look like a parody of The Terminal. Only instead of an airport, there's a sleepy street. Instead of Tom Hanks, there's a pensioner with a shopping bag. And instead of a departure board, there are signs by front doors. The state here is so obsessed with its borders that it's prepared to split not just the country in half, but also any given bathroom. The history of this tidy madness didn't start yesterday, and not even at the moment when European officials discovered the pleasure of writing regulations across hundreds of pages. The roots go back to the Middle Ages, when land wasn't so much a territory on a map as a bundle of rights, debts, vassal obligations, rents, and privileges. At the end of the 10th century, holdings in Barl were divided between the Dukes of Brabant and the Lords of Breda, later connected to the House of Nassau. Some plots remained with the Duke, others passed under Breda's authority, and nobody, presumably, imagined that centuries later those feudal bookkeeping entries would turn into an international puzzle, photographed by tourists with the expression of people who found a bug in reality. Then came the big treaties, wars, declarations of independence, and other events, after which normal countries usually pick up a ruler and agree, here's the border. But Barl wasn't normal. After the Peace of Westphalia, the Nassau lands drifted into a northern political orbit, while the Brabantian plots remained tied to the south. Later, when Belgium and the Netherlands finally parted ways like spouses after a long and not especially happy marriage, it turned out that in Barl it was impossible to draw one honest line without cutting history into small pieces. The Maastricht Treaty of the mid-19th century didn't so much solve the problem as officially acknowledge its existence. Plots were distributed according to historical ownership, and the mosaic became not a curiosity, but law. The most wonderful thing about Barl isn't the fact of the enclaves itself, but how matter-of-factly people have learned to live inside a geographical joke. Imagine a house where the living room looks out into one country, the bedroom slumbers in another, and the bathroom philosophically reflects on the nature of sovereignty. Local accounts often mention a house on Loveren with two addresses. The door there is literally tied to the borderline, and the residents receive service through two postal systems. Local historians add an almost theatrical detail. Inside, you can watch television in Belgium and sleep in the Netherlands. This isn't a metaphor for European unity, it's a practical user guide to the absurd. Elsewhere, the border passes through public space as naturally as if it grew there alongside the paving tiles. White crosses on the floor, metal pins, country letters on either side. All of this turns a walk into a slow game of Find the State, a game with unexpectedly serious rules, mind you. A cafe can have tables on different sides of the line, a shop can have its cash registers in different jurisdictions, and a customer gets the rare chance to buy a product in one country, pay for it practically in another, and step outside feeling like they've just completed a diplomatic mission at the level of a spy thriller, but with a bag of cookies. Barla got acquainted with smugglers too, of course. It would have been strange if a place where a state border can lie between a wardrobe and a stool didn't attract people with a creative relationship to customs law. Local historical accounts recall that in the past, tobacco, butter, livestock, and anything that could be carried, driven, or quickly hidden was actively moved across the border. And honestly, the geography itself was practically winking at the violators. To leave one country, sometimes all you needed wasn't a heroic escape through the forest, but a confident step across the street. This isn't the Great Wall. It's more like Ocean's 11, filmed in a village where the main special effect is cadastral confusion. The absurdity was especially sharp where the laws of neighboring countries differed in small ways. Shop hours, Sunday trading, fuel prices, closing time rules. In a normal city, all that is a matter for local administration. In Barl, it became a chess match between two legal systems. Historians note that queues could form at Belgian petrol stations when prices there were lower, and trade rules had to be coordinated so that entrepreneurs from one country didn't feel penalized for the wrong placement of their shop window. The border here didn't just divide states. It walked into the cash register, peeked at the accounts, and quietly whispered, "Now try to file this correctly." I particularly enjoy imagining the local official who receives a complaint from Barl for the first time. Where did the violation occur? In the shop. In which country? Depends on the department. Who's responsible? Ask the door. Where is the door? Exactly. This place looks as though human bureaucracy once decided to prove it could rival surrealism. Salvador Dali melted clocks. Barl melts borders. The difference is that clocks at least don't require residential registration. But strangely, in this comedy there's no sense of catastrophe. Barla doesn't look like a wound on the map. It looks like a neatly healed scar that the locals have long since learned to show tourists with a slight smile. For them, this isn't a daily nervous breakdown. It's part of the environment. White crosses on the pavement, two signs, two municipalities, two traditions, one market, a shared rhythm of life. Tourists come here for the impossible shot. One foot in Belgium, the other in the Netherlands, pretending they've figured out Europe. The locals, it seems, figured out something more a long time ago. State lines matter, but bread still needs to be bought in the morning, rubbish taken out in the evening, and a neighbor remains a neighbor, even if their postcode belongs to another country. And yet, Barla isn't just a charming curiosity. It's a monument to how decisions made by feudal lords for the sake of tax rights and land convenience can outlive empires, wars, treaties, reforms, and generations of lawyers. It's a time capsule where the Middle Ages didn't disappear, but changed into modern tiles, signs, and tourist routes. Here, history doesn't lie in a museum under glass. It stands at your doorstep and asks which country you plan to have breakfast in today. Barla teaches us an uncomfortable but useful truth. A border isn't always a fence on the horizon. Sometimes it's a line in the hallway, sometimes a sign by the door, sometimes the right of one state to begin exactly where another state's doormat ends. And if somewhere on this planet there exists a better monument to human inconsistency, it's certainly also standing on a border between two jurisdictions, paying taxes through a complicated scheme, and unable to decide who to call for a plumber. But our route is only just beginning, because if Barla is a map turned into a lace doily for a bureaucratic tea party, then ahead of us lies a place even more poisonously beautiful, a land that states abandon so unanimously as if it were the bill at a bad restaurant. There the border doesn't cut through a house. There the territory itself becomes a question that nobody wants. Story number 2. Bir Tawil, the desert that nobody wants to call their own. After Barla, where the border strolled through doors, living rooms, and sidewalks with the grace of a maniac, you'd think the map couldn't laugh at humanity any harder. But the map, like a bad magician at a corporate party, always has one more trick up its sleeve. Now we shift from damp European tidiness to a desert between Egypt and Sudan, to a place where instead of white crosses on cobblestones, there is stone, dust, heat, a dry wind, and such silence that it feels like bureaucracy itself died of dehydration and was buried without witnesses. There are no cozy cafes here where you can put one foot in Belgium and the other in the Netherlands. Here, if you put your foot in the wrong place, the most that changes is the amount of sand in your shoe. And yet, this very place is one of the strangest political tricks on the planet, a territory that no recognized state wants to claim. Bir Tawil doesn't look like a prize, it looks like a punishment for a cartographer. Picture a flat, scorched, nearly lifeless area where the horizon shimmers with heat. Rocks lie around as though a giant left them there after failing to build a decent pyramid, and the wind speaks exclusively in the language of sandpaper. No border booths, no lazily raised barriers, no customs officers who ask your purpose of travel with the tone of a person who suspects you're smuggling cheese. Just a desert, harsh and indifferent, like a clerk on a Friday afternoon a few minutes before the window closes. According to widely available geographical sources, Bir Tawil covers roughly 2,060 square kilometers, has no permanent population, and no surface water. Its status is tied to a conflict between two different lines of the Egyptian-Sudanese border. The most deceptive thing about Bir Tawil is its apparent simplicity. On a map, it's just an uneven quadrilateral, a dry patch between two countries, the kind of thing a school child might color yellow and forget about. But look more closely and you find not emptiness, but a legal trap. On one side is Egypt, on the other, Sudan. Both states would seem to have normal, state-like feelings of ownership toward land. Plant a flag, appoint an administration, come up with an anthem for the local land registry, put up at least one dull sign with a coat of arms. But no. Bir Tawil is that rare case where a territory lies between states, and the states pretend it's someone else's suitcase in the waiting room. The key to this puzzle lies not in the sand but in the archive, which itself sounds ominous. In the late 19th century, the British imperial hand, accustomed to drawing borders with the confidence of someone who's sailing home on a ship tomorrow anyway, drew a political line between Egypt and Sudan along the 22nd parallel. This line was beautiful in the way all straight lines on maps are beautiful. It didn't ask mountains, tribes, nomadic routes, or human realities whether they enjoyed being cut by geometry. Later, in the early 20th century, a second line appeared, an administrative one, more winding, taking into account who actually used which lands. Under this version, Bir Tawil was assigned to the Egyptian administrative zone because it was used by groups connected to the Aswan region, and the Hala'ib Triangle near the Red Sea was assigned to the Sudanese administrative system. And here is where the real theater of the absurd begins. Egypt benefits from the first straight line. Under it, the disputed Hala'ib Triangle becomes Egyptian, and Bir Tawil becomes Sudanese. Sudan benefits from the second administrative line. Under it, Hala'ib can be considered Sudanese, and Bir Tawil becomes Egyptian. As a result, both states say roughly the following: Hala'ib is ours, and Bir Tawil? Bir Tawil, continuing the diplomatic pantomime, turns out to be the relative at the family party whom everyone has seen, but nobody wants to take home. Because claiming it means indirectly agreeing to the borderline that weakens the claim to the far more important Hala'ib, which has access to the Red Sea and much greater political value. So Bir Tawil lies to one side, dry, prickly, wanted by no one, like a utilities receipt for a house that hasn't been built yet. This is the geopolitical version of the childhood game, Not Mine. Only children usually argue over a broken vase, while here they're arguing over land. And the land itself isn't at fault. It simply ended up in an unfortunate spot between two incompatible cartographic decisions. If Bir Tawil were a port, an oasis, a city, an oil region, or even a pleasantly named resort for extreme tanning enthusiasts, its fate would probably have been different. But it's a desert pocket without a sea, without permanent settlements, and without any obvious economic magic. In a world where states sometimes argue over a rock that barely fits a seagull, Bir Tawil looks almost offensively unwanted. Yet emptiness rarely stays empty in the human imagination. Where states go silent, dreamers appear. Adventurers and people who really want their business card to start with the word king. The most famous story happened in the summer of 2014, when American Jeremiah Heaton traveled to Bir Tawil, planted a homemade flag, and declared the creation of the Kingdom of North Sudan. According to press reports, his motive was almost fairy tale-like. He wanted to fulfill his daughter's wish to be a princess. In a normal family, you buy a plastic crown for that, throw a birthday party with cake, and make peace with glitter on the carpet. Heaton, apparently, decided that weak people buy crowns, while strong people look for terra nullius in the African desert. This scene practically writes itself as a film. The camera sweeps over the desert, dust trails behind the wheels, a man gets out of a car, holds a flag, looks around at rocks and a horizon with no palace, no subjects, not even a kiosk selling cold water. He plants the flag in the ground and tells the world, "There's a kingdom here now." At that moment, somewhere in the distance, international law presumably slowly covers its face with its palm, because real sovereignty doesn't arise from a single flag, any more than a restaurant arises from placing a fork on a rock. You need recognition, governance, a population, stable institutions, and a whole lot of boring but necessary things that distinguish a state from theatrical props. Heaton, according to journalistic materials, tried to present the project as a peaceful initiative and even spoke about agricultural research, but his kingdom received no legal recognition. You could laugh and move on, but Bir Tawil turned out to be a magnet for exactly these kinds of fantasies. After Heaton, other self-proclaimed claimants appeared, each with their own flag, website, manifesto, or dream of a micronation. Some saw a chance to build a utopia, others an internet project with titles and coats of arms. Some, presumably, just wanted to feel like the hero of a computer strategy game, where clicking "Found a Nation" is faster than filling out travel insurance. But the desert is patient. It accepts flags, declarations, photographs, and grand names, then does what it does best, erases the traces with wind. The next morning, the kingdom looks again, like stones, sand, and the absence of infrastructure. In this place, the crunch of colonial logic that outlived its authors is especially audible. When an outside power draws lines first one way, then another, and then leaves, local states are left living inside a geometric inheritance that resembles a badly assembled piece of flat-pack furniture, with no picture in the instructions. Bir Tawil isn't just a strange border, it's a document left on a table where two fields were filled in with different ink, and the signature was blurred by time. The political line says one thing, the administrative line another. The actual life of nomadic groups once said a third thing. Modern diplomacy prefers to say as little as possible because every word can be turned against the speaker. It's important not to romanticize Bir Tawil as no man's land in the spirit of an adventure novel. The phrase terra nullius sounds beautiful, especially if you say it in the half-dark of a library, but it carries a heavy history. Too often such language was used to ignore people who were already living, walking, herding cattle, and knowing the paths, wells, seasonal routes, and survival rules of places that a desk-bound cartographer saw as emptiness. In Bir Tawil's case, there is no permanent population, but the historical use of the territory by nomadic groups is a reminder. A desert doesn't equal an empty place. It may be a page without a city, but not without memory. That's why every new self-proclaimed monarch who arrives here with a flag and a dream looks not just funny, but slightly awkward, like a person who walked into someone else's silence and started loudly rehearsing a coronation. If you tried to picture a border guard of Bir Tawil, you'd get an almost mystical character. He stands in a uniform the color of sand, though he has no uniform. He checks documents, though there's no booth. He raises a barrier, though any barrier would have long since dried out, rusted, and been carried off by the wind toward some even more meaningless line. His steps don't sound on the concrete floor of a checkpoint. They sink into gravel. He stamps no passport, because whose country's stamp? What authority? What address? In his imaginary visitor's log, the entries would be not names but human illusions. A dreamer arrived, a self-appointed king departed, a blogger passed through, the sand stayed put. In Bir Tawil, it's simultaneously funny and disturbing that the state border becomes not a line but a negation of a line. In Barla, the border was too detailed, too intrusive, almost domestic. It walked into someone's kitchen and asked which country the kettle stood in. In Bir Tawil, the border is the opposite. It turns into silence. It doesn't come, it doesn't ask, it pretends it doesn't exist, even though its very contradictions created the whole situation. This isn't a wall, a fence, or a checkpoint. It's a legal pause the length of a desert. The irony reaches an almost perfect form. Humanity has a place that could be called no one's. Not because it's beyond imagination, but because acknowledging it is too inconvenient for the neighbors. States, usually jealous of every inch of territory, suddenly become models of restraint. They seem to stand at the edges of the map, nodding at each other and saying, "No, no, after you." But behind this politeness hides not altruism, but cold arithmetic. Bir Tawil is a small sacrifice for a big stake, a desert pawn that nobody wants to play because you might lose a more important piece. The best monument to human inconsistency here isn't a flag, a stone, or a line on a map. The best monument is the very absence of a monument. A no man's land born of two mismatched borders became a mirror in which states look simultaneously rational and ridiculous. They don't want Bir Tawil not because they forgot about it, but because they remember too well about somewhere else. So the desert becomes a legal shadow of Halaib, a territory footnote, a geographical butt written between two state positions. And if Barla showed us how a border can become too close, too domestic, almost intimate, then Bir Tawil shows the opposite extreme, a border from which everyone has stepped back, leaving it in a strange diplomatic vacuum. Where anthems usually play, only wind is heard. Where a coat of arms should stand, a rock lies. Where micronation fantasists see a crown, the desert sees another person who underestimated the air temperature and overestimated the power of a homemade flag. But ahead of us lies a border of a completely different type, not a desert abandoned by states, and not a European village where a country begins at your doormat. The next stop is a place where people lived for decades in a genuine geographical labyrinth. Enclaves, counter-enclaves, fields, roads, and villages where the path to a neighbor could turn into an international operation. There, the map is no longer just. Story number 3. The Indian-Bangladeshi Chitmahals, the Matryoshka doll in which the state got lost. After Bir Tawil, that desert territory of excuse where states cheerfully pretend nothing is written on the sand, we return to a place where the border was instead written in far too small a handwriting. Picture not a line, but a tangle, not a wall, but a puzzle scattered across a table, with half the pieces clearly brought from a different game. Northern Bengal, humid air, rice paddies, banana leaves, a reddish road after rain, tin-roofed tea stalls, cows looking at international law with the calm that international law has always been missing. On the surface, an ordinary rural edge of South Asia, green, noisy, smelling of earth, smoke, spices, and warm water in the ditches. But open an old map and the landscape suddenly turns into a puzzle that Borges might have dreamed up after an overly long conversation with a British surveyor. We're talking about the former enclaves between India and Bangladesh, known as Chitmahals. That word sounds almost soft, like the name of an antique fabric, but it concealed one of the most mercilessly absurd borders of the modern world. Before the Great Territorial Exchange in 2015, dozens of islands of one country existed inside the other, and inside some of those islands were new islands of the first country, and even one tiny plot that was an enclave inside a counter-enclave inside an enclave. If Barla looked like a lace doily, this border was not a doily anymore, but an accounting ledger that had been dropped in a swamp, dried out, stamped with an official seal, and declared international order. On the ground, everything looked deceptively simple. A field started at a house and ended at a ditch. Beyond the ditch was another path, then a bamboo fence, then a small market selling fish, soap, kerosene, and news. No natural boundary to command respect. No mountain range, no wide river, no stone wall where you could stand dramatically in a coat like a character from a historical series. And that simplicity was exactly the trap. A person could walk to the neighboring field and legally end up in another country, though all around remained the same palm trees, the same smell of fried onions, the same children running barefoot across wet earth. The border here didn't always look like a fence. More often it was a rumor, an old person's memory, an entry in a land registry, the fear of a checkpoint on the road, and the phrase, "Better not go there without papers." The history of this labyrinth goes back long before the arrival of modern passports, visas, and border stamps. That is, long before humanity definitively decided to complicate its own life. The region contained the holdings of the Kuch Bahar Principality and the lands of Rangpur, tied to different centers of power. Plots changed hands, were fixed by treaties, given away, leased, held by force or habit. Local legends love to recount how some villages were apparently gambled away in chess or cards between rulers. Historians treat this version cautiously, but the legend is too good not to mention. Because if anywhere on Earth a border really could have been created by a gambling game and a feudal lord in a bad mood, this is the place where it looks exactly like someone sat down at a board, pushed the pieces around, forgot to clear up the consequences, and centuries later thousands of people inherited a match that still hadn't finished. Then came the partition of British India. Paper rustled in offices, lines ran across maps, new states were born, old feudal patches suddenly became international problems. What had previously been a quirky local feature turned into a border anomaly between India and the then East Pakistan and later Bangladesh. Imagine. Yesterday your plot was part of the tangled legacy of princely lands, and today it turned out to be formally India, surrounded by someone else's territory, or Bangladesh, squeezed inside India. On a map this looked like freckles. In life, it looked like a sentence to endless requests. Let me through, permit me, sign this, confirm it, explain why I live here and who's supposed to fix this road. The number of these fragments itself sounds like a diagnosis. Inside Bangladesh, there were 111 Indian enclaves. Inside India, 51 Bangladeshi enclaves. Inside some Indian enclaves lurked Bangladeshi counter-enclaves, and inside one such counter-enclave sat the Indian plot of Dahala Kagrabari, a small, almost mockingly tiny piece of land that was India inside Bangladesh, inside India, inside Bangladesh. This isn't geography anymore. It's a nested folder on an old computer where each next folder is called Final Version New, and Don't Touch, Important. If Dante had written not about circles of hell but about administrative units, one of the circles would certainly have been called Dahala Kagrabari. Let's linger there, in that tiny wonder of bureaucratic origami. Dahala Kagrabari was so small it was often described as little more than a field, but its legal biography was grander than that of many capitals. To get there from mainland India, you'd have to mentally cross Bangladesh, then the Indian enclave of Balapara Kagrabari, then the Bangladeshi counter-enclave at Upanchauki Bujni, and only then arrive at the Indian point hidden inside all those layers. In a normal video game, a map like that would be flagged as a developer error. In real life, people lived there, grew crops, argued over boundaries, married off children, looked for doctors, and tried to explain to officials that they were not a philosophical problem, but a population. The most frightening thing about the Chitmahals wasn't that they looked strange on a map. Maps tolerate a lot. What was more frightening was that the state there was often present like a ghost, formally existing, practically distant, legally important, physically inaccessible. Residents of the enclave spent decades dealing with problems around documents, schools, police, medical care, electricity, roads, and the simple right to be noticed. To get to their own country, it was often necessary to cross the territory of another, which meant needing a permit, risking delays, explaining why you were carrying a sack of rice, a sick child, or wedding gifts through international absurdity. Bureaucracy here wasn't sitting at a desk. It was growing in the road like a thorny bush. Try to picture a local resident's morning. A rooster crows, fog lies over the fields. Tea cools in a tin mug. His wife asks him to go to the market. The child needs to go to school. And already in his head, a root of intelligence operation complexity is taking shape. That little bridge is in another country. That road is under foreign control. You can pass this way if the checkpoint has calm people today. Don't argue here. Don't go there after dark. In a normal world, a person thinks, don't forget to buy salt. In a Chitmahal, buying salt could turn into a diplomatic adventure. Here is where the terminal becomes not a film, but a way of life. Only instead of an airport, there are fields. Instead of waiting room chairs, there are bamboo fences. And instead of a departures board, there are rumors about which crossing is open today. Border guards in such a world also became characters of a special genre. Picture a post on a road. The uniform bleached by sun, the boots covered in dust. A kettle on a small burner nearby. A dog lying in the shade that has long since understood that sovereignty smells of sweat, paper, and cheap tobacco. On one hand, an order to guard the border. On the other, standing before you is not a spy from a Le Carré novel, but a farmer on a bicycle with greens, medicines, and exhaustion in the basket. And the state, as always, demands precision where life requires flexibility. There were also moments of absurdity that could have been comedy had they not been part of everyday life. A wedding between families from different enclaves could turn into a logistical spectacle. Guests were asking not just where the celebration was, but through which countries they'd be traveling to get there. Buying a cow, delivering building materials, a trip to the doctor, registering a birth, everything acquired the flavor of international coordination. Even death, that last and usually unambiguous event of a human biography, could, in such places, run up against the question, which cemetery, which road, with whose permission? Let's not turn this into a grim chronicle. It's enough to say that the border knew how to intrude even where basic courtesy suggested it should stay quiet. A special chapter was the Tin Biga Corridor, a narrow strip providing access to the Bangladeshi enclave of Dahagram Angarpota. The phrase access corridor alone sounds as if a person is a parcel to be delivered through a warehouse according to instructions. People living in Dahagram Angarpota needed a connection to the main territory of Bangladesh, and that connection was for many years a subject of agreements, passage regimes, schedules, and political disputes. A place where an ordinary road should simply have been an ordinary road turned into a symbol of what states can do to a human route, a legal breathing tube, something like an oxygen mask issued to a village on the terms of intergovernmental caution. And yet, this story has a rare moment of something close to a hopeful ending. After long negotiations, India and Bangladesh finally decided to exchange enclaves and simplify the border. At midnight at the end of July 2015, most of these fragments officially changed hands, and residents were given the opportunity to choose their citizenship and stop being people whose lives depended on an old feudal crumb on a map. Of course, no document repairs roads, schools, memories, and mistrust overnight, but the very fact that the map became even slightly more like a tool for living rather than an insulting puzzle was almost a miracle. Bureaucracy, to our surprise, can sometimes not only tangle its own knots, but untangle them too. Admittedly, it does so at a speed suggesting it's filling out every form in triplicate and waiting for a stamp from someone who stepped out for lunch. The Chit Mahals remain a great monument to human inconsistency, precisely because in them, the absurdity was not decorative but domestic, not tourist, not museum quality, not funny from the outside. It lived in roots, fears, queues, marriages, markets, school notebooks, hospital journeys. It showed how an old deal, an unverified line, and political stubbornness can move into a village and tell people for decades, "Your life is too complicated for our map. Please wait at the invisible barrier." Today, the former enclaves no longer look like the world's main attraction of border surrealism. The lines have simplified, statuses have changed, the signs have become less insane, but the memory of them matters precisely as a warning. A map is not God, though states love to treat it like a sacred object. A line on paper doesn't feel the mud on your feet, doesn't hear a child coughing, doesn't know the price of a sack of rice, and doesn't understand why a person needs to reach a doctor before sunset. So every time someone draws a border too confidently, it's worth picturing Dahala Kagrabari, a small field hidden inside so many layers of statehood that the very concept of statehood starts nervously straightening its collar. But our journey through the geography of absurdity isn't over at the unraveled labyrinth. Ahead is a place where the border doesn't just divide land or surround villages, it turns an entire peninsula into a diplomatic knot where a military base, monkeys, an airport, a rock, and an old imperial argument coexist in a landscape that looks as if history. Story number 4. Gibraltar. The rock, the barrier, and the airport where European history forgot to leave the stage. After the Indian-Bangladeshi Chit Mahals, where the map turned into a Matryoshka doll with an administrative migraine, you'd want to breathe some sea air and see something more straightforward. A rock, say. A rock is an honest thing. It just stands there, stays quiet, doesn't require citizenship papers, doesn't divide into enclaves within enclaves, and generally gives the impression of an object that's hard to ruin with bureaucracy. But humanity, as we know, doesn't take the easy road. So the next stop is Gibraltar, the place where a massive limestone ridge stares out at the Mediterranean with the air of something that knows all the weaknesses of empire. And at its foot runs one of the most fraught, theatrical, and symbolically overloaded borders in Europe. At first, everything seems almost holiday-like. The light cuts into your eyes, the sea sparkles, Africa is visible on the horizon, seagulls cry with the intonations of harbor gossips, and the wind drags with it the smell of salt, fried fish, petrol, and old stone. The Spanish city of La Línea de la Concepción lies on one side, the British overseas territory of Gibraltar on the other. Between them is not a continental rift, not a deep river, not a fortress wall from a historical epic, but a comparatively short land crossing where in the mornings people walk to work, tourists drag suitcases, cars inch slowly toward document checks, and over everything looms the rock, like a giant stone beast that's lying down to guard the entrance to the Mediterranean. If Barley whispered absurdity underfoot and Bir Tawil fell silent in the sand, Gibraltar speaks aloud, with a British accent, Spanish grievance, and the roar of a departing plane. The main scene here is almost unbelievable. The road that people use to cross the border runs right past the airport's runway, and city life is literally forced to yield to aviation. In any standard understanding of Gibraltar, this is one of the most cinematic details. The barrier comes down, traffic stops. Cars wait, pedestrians wait, and down the strip that ordinary people were crossing just moments ago, a plane taxis. You were just walking through something resembling a normal border crossing, and suddenly you find yourself in a set where the terminal meets Spy Bridge, with a rock the size of an imperial memory added above. In a normal city, an airport is separated by fences, schemes, security zones, and nervous announcements. In Gibraltar, the geography itself seems to shrug. Not much land, history is heavy. Walk carefully, there's a plane taking off. But the road and the airport are only the visible part of this limestone iceberg. The real absurdity of Gibraltar begins with the question of whose it is. Formally, Gibraltar has been under British sovereignty since the early 18th century, when it was ceded to Britain under the Treaty of Utrecht after the War of the Spanish Succession. For London, it's an overseas territory, a strategic point, a symbol of naval control and resilience. For Madrid, it's an unhealed historical thorn, a piece of the Iberian Peninsula that ended up under a foreign flag. For the locals, it's home, something that can't be reduced to diplomatic notes, old treaties, or other people's slogans. And for the tourist, it's a place where you can buy a souvenir with a British flag, hear Spanish spoken, see a monkey steal your bag of food, and realize that geopolitics is rarely elegant. The Gibraltar border is particularly strange because it simultaneously connects and divides. On one hand, it's a daily artery. For decades, many people from Spain worked in Gibraltar, crossing this line as part of their morning routine. In the morning across, in the evening back, with tiredness in their shoulders and a shopping bag in hand. On the other hand, it's a symbolic nerve. Touch it slightly and it starts hurting at the level of governments, newspaper headlines, and national pride. Sometimes, the queue at the crossing is just a queue. Other times, it looks like a miniature version of a large historical claim, neatly stretched between a checkpoint booth and exhaust fumes. There's something almost theatrical about this border. Picture a morning. From the Spanish side, there's still the smell of coffee from the bars of La Línea, where metal spoons ring against cups like tiny bells of everyday anxiety. People walk quickly. Someone adjusts a bag. Someone holds documents already open to save time. At the crossing, you hear short exchanges, scanners, footsteps on asphalt, the low rumble of engines. Overhead is the sky. Underfoot, the earth. All around is Europe, which has long enjoyed telling itself that its borders have become softer, more reasonable, more humane. And right there, beside all of that, stands this old line, reminding you, don't rush to conclusions. History hasn't yet signed the handover certificate for common sense. Spain's pain around Gibraltar doesn't come down to mere stubbornness. For Spain, this rock is the trace of imperial humiliation, frozen on the southern shore like a stone marginal note. Long ago, great powers divided the world without asking those who would have to live with the consequences. For Britain, it's conversely a symbol of strategic memory, the gateway to the Mediterranean, the place where the naval empire once kept its hand on the pulse of trade routes and military logistics. Gibraltar stands at the strait where Europe almost touches Africa, and that position makes it not just a beautiful rock, but a natural watchtower. It's no surprise that powers looked at it not as a landscape, but as a lever. The word rock feels insufficient here. The Rock of Gibraltar is not just a geological object, but almost a character. It rises above the city with the heavy confidence of a seasoned actor who needs no lines to dominate the scene. In its limestone cavities are hidden tunnels, military galleries, storerooms, traces of sieges, wars, and engineering stubbornness. It has witnessed ships, cannons, flags, blockades, diplomatic oaths, and tourists in overly bright shorts. It has seen regimes and rhetoric change, while remaining in place itself, with the look of a creature that understands that states often talk about eternity, but rarely hold up to comparison with stone. A particularly significant episode in this story is the 20th century, when the political dispute stopped being merely a dispute between diplomats and struck the people who simply lived nearby. During the Franco era, the Spanish side closed the land border, and this decision severed the familiar ties between families, workers, and neighbors. Imagine a city where yesterday the road was part of everyday life, and today it becomes a locked door between people who are close to each other. No fantasy, no dragon, no curse, just a government decision. A stamp, a soldier, a barrier, and suddenly a vast distance between places that can be seen with the naked eye. This is the highest magic of bureaucracy, creating remoteness without distance. That episode makes Gibraltar not just an exotic spot for photographs, but a reminder that a border can be not just a line of control, but a tool of pressure. It can regulate goods, people, emotions, family dinners, funerals, weddings, work shifts, small habits, and large grievances. In a film, such a story would be shot with dramatic music and close-ups of hands pressed against closed gates. In reality, it was less beautiful and far more exhausting. Waiting, detours, letters, permits, the impossibility of simply going somewhere that was a road just the day before. After the crossing reopened, life began moving more freely, but the dispute didn't dissolve anywhere. It simply learned to live in new surroundings. Europe changed, regimes changed, borders opened and became subject to checking again, and Gibraltar kept existing in a state of constant, yes, but. Yes, it's a lively city. Yes, it has its own institutions, shops, schools, a port, an airport, tourist routes. But nearby always hangs the question that can't be finally brushed aside. How long can a historical claim remain a political fact when the people on the ground have long since developed their own identity? The Gibraltarians aren't extras in this play. They're not simply the population of a disputed territory waiting for big capitals to decide their fate behind closed doors. They have their own voice, and it has sounded clearly more than once. Many residents want to remain connected to Britain and have no desire for a transfer of sovereignty to Spain. In this, there's yet another layer of absurdity for the outside observer. Madrid can talk about territorial integrity, London about the right to self-determination, lawyers about treaties, historians about old concessions, and meanwhile a local resident is simply walking down a street where signs, accents, habits, and flags have long since created a particular Gibraltarian blend. Try explaining to someone that their home is primarily an argument in someone else's dispute. They'll probably nod politely and go have coffee. And the monkeys, of course. You can't talk about Gibraltar without mentioning the Barbary macaques, those woolly diplomats without briefcases who have done more for the territory's tourist image than many official brochures. They live on the rock, watch people with the brazen wisdom of minor officials, and behave as though they are the true guardians of sovereignty. There's an old legend: as long as the macaques remain on Gibraltar, the British will remain too. The legend, of course, sounds like the perfect advertising slogan for an empire that's run out of more convincing arguments. But it has its own. Diplomats argue, governments change, and the macaque, meanwhile, grabs a tourist's bag and demonstrates a practical model of power. Whoever controls the food controls the situation. If you listen to this border in the evening, it sounds different from the morning. During the day, bustle, documents, engines, tourist voices, airport announcements, the squeak of suitcase wheels. In the evening, the light softens, the rock darkens, the sea grows heavy, and the line between Spain and Gibraltar becomes a quiet stage where every movement feels like part of an old play. A person comes back from work. The border guard looks at a passport. A car slowly moves forward. Somewhere behind you, a cafe door closes. Everything is ordinary, almost dull. But in that ordinariness, the strangeness is hiding. Next to us isn't a museum exhibit, but a living dispute that has learned to breathe to the rhythm of a working day. Gibraltar is the best monument to human inconsistency because it's simultaneously too small and too large. Too small to justify centuries of political anxiety, cues, slogans, and symbolic battles, and too large to be written off as an accidental rock at the edge of a map. It stands at a strait where geography itself raises the stakes. It carries the memory of empire, war, siege, a closed border, an open crossing, an airport cutting through the urban fabric, and monkeys who, I suspect, regard all treaties with total absence of respect. In Barla, the border walked into someone's house. In Bir Tawil, it disappeared into the desert. In the Chip Mahals, it tangled a village in a feudal knot. In Gibraltar, the border becomes a stage where every day a performance is staged about how the past refuses to be the past. Here you can stand at the crossing, look at the rock, and think that common sense may exist somewhere, but it certainly doesn't always pass through passport control. And further on our route becomes even tighter, almost domestic. We're heading somewhere the border doesn't just pass through a city, but touches windows, balconies, fences, family roots, and old habits. In the next story, the international line will look like a neighborhood dispute that went on. Story number 5. Derby Line and Stansted. The library where a book can lie in Canada while the reader sits in the USA. After Gibraltar, where the rock gazes at the strait with the expression of an ancient imperial witness, our route grows quieter. We leave the sea, the monkeys, the runway, the stone that made diplomats straighten their ties for centuries. Now before us is North American provincialism in its almost painfully innocent form. Trees, neat houses, lawns, mailboxes, low fences, road signs, modest churches, cool air, and such everyday silence that the most dramatic event of the day seems to be a neighbor who started mowing too early. At first glance, this place promises no absurdity. It promises hot coffee, a school bus, wet leaves on the asphalt, and conversations about the weather. But step closer, and you find that right here, an international border behaves like an ill-mannered guest who walked into town without taking off their shoes and went straight through the library. Derby Line is in the American state of Vermont. Stansted is in the Canadian province of Quebec. Between them runs the border between the USA and Canada, but not in the way a well-behaved border should run if it had finished even elementary school in common sense. It doesn't hide in a forest, doesn't follow a wide river, doesn't climb a mountain range. It passes through streets, yards, houses, and a famous library with an opera hall where you can literally find yourself between states without having had time to turn a page. This isn't the kind of border from films about escapes and searchlights. This is a border from a small northern town where absurdity wears a cardigan, greets the neighbors, and knows which day the rubbish goes out. At first, everything seems too normal. Here's a street, houses on one side, houses on the other, a bicycle on a porch, curtains in the window, a hose lying in the garden. Somewhere a dog barks with such a sense of duty that it seems to be guarding not the yard, but the Westphalian system itself. But then you notice the road signs, the cameras, the unusual barriers, the strange routes, and in your head, a lock slowly clicks. This isn't just a street, this is the line between two states. Where in Barla, white crosses on the pavement turned Europe into a board game, here the North American border looks like a neighborhood agreement that one day ended up in the hands of security services and became nervous. The most famous symbol of this place is the Haskell Free Library and Opera House. The building stands directly on the border, not near the border, not opposite it, not 2 steps away, on it. A black line inside the building shows where the USA ends and Canada begins, and it looks as if the architect secretly worked for a theater of the absurd. In a single space, books, seats, the stage, balconies, and corridors turn out to be part of international geography. You can stand at a shelf in one country, take a few steps, and be in another, without seeing any border guard, any barrier, any stern person asking whether you're carrying fruit, alcohol, or suspicious intentions. Especially wonderful is the opera hall. It is often described as an almost geopolitical joke with velvet seats. The stage is on the Canadian side. Most of the auditorium is on the American side. Picture a performance. An actor steps out, takes a tragic pause. The hall holds its breath, and somewhere in the invisible space between the footlights and the seats, international law quietly coughs. The characters deliver a monologue in Canada. The audience applauds from the USA. If an actor overplays, it's no longer just a theatrical problem, but almost a cross-border. A theater like this could have been dreamed up by Bulgakov if Walland had decided to take a tour to Vermont instead of Moscow. The library was conceived as a symbol of unity between two neighboring communities. Its founders wanted residents on both sides of the border to be able to use one cultural space. There's a rare beauty in that gesture, building a house for books not despite the border, but over it. Like a bridge, only with shelves, stairs, and the smell of old paper. In an ideal world, this would be a lesson. Here are people, here is knowledge, here is a stage, here are books. As for the line on the map, let it behave itself and not get in the way. But the ideal world, as we know, usually loses to the real one in the very first round, because the real one has instructions, anxious agencies, and a person with a stamp. For a long time, local life around the border was remarkably soft. Families visited each other, neighbors crossed the line almost like an ordinary street. Children grew up with the feeling that two countries don't necessarily mean two walls. Here, the border was more a habit than a threat. It lived in addresses, taxes, school systems, accents, different flags, but not always in people's muscles. A person could feel it, but didn't necessarily have to fear it. It was like a strict older relative. Yes, they sit at the table. Yes, they occasionally remind you of the rules, but on the whole, you can have tea and a conversation. Then the world became more anxious. After the early years of this century, when security in North America sharply changed its tone, the border at Derby Line and Stansted stopped being just a quiet line between neighbors. Where people had previously been able to cross by their usual route, restrictions appeared: cameras, blocks, warnings, new rules. The invisible line suddenly became visible in the most unpleasant sense, not as a cultural feature, but as a regime. And that's where all the cruel comedy of the situation revealed itself. When a border runs through a forest, tightening it looks expected. When it runs through a city, tightening starts to resemble trying to put a bulletproof vest on a tea service. This is especially strange to feel on streets where houses and families have historically been used to mixed life. Imagine someone whose relative lives literally right there, but already in another country. You can see the window, see the house, see the smoke from the chimney. The dog probably recognizes you too. But the route to that house is no longer a simple movement through space. It's a legal procedure. You must go through an official crossing, explain your purpose, show documents, comply with rules. Geographically, the distance can be tiny. Bureaucratically, it suddenly swells to the size of a Tolstoy novel, only with more border formalities and fewer balls. There's something almost Kafkaesque about this scene. An old neighbor steps out onto the porch, waves at you. You wave back. Between you, a few dozen steps. Air, a lawn, habit, memory. But the state stands nearby like an invisible wardrobe and says, "Please follow the designated route." Here is civilization. To reach someone you've known for half your life, you must prove you're not a threat to national security. You're just bringing a pie. And the pie, it may turn out, will also raise questions. States can be suspicious even of baked goods if they cross a border without proper respect. The Haskell Library, in this sense, became not just a landmark, but almost a diplomatic being. It continued to be a place people from both sides could visit, but the very possibility of such a visit required delicate balance. Canadians could enter the building through the American side under special conditions, without turning a trip for a book into a full-blown immigration drama. But step out the wrong door, turn the wrong way, stay in the wrong spot, and a cultural outing can shift to a different genre altogether. In an ordinary library, you're asked to keep quiet. In this library, if you push the absurdity to its limit, international law also keeps quiet, standing between the shelves. Picture the smell inside: old wood, bindings, dust, soft light, creaking floorboards, the muffled voice of a librarian. Somewhere on the floor runs a line. Not decorative, not playful, not from a museum. A state line. It lies calmly, like a snake confident that everyone already knows of its presence. A child might ask, "Why is there a stripe here?" The adults will begin explaining about the border, countries, history, control, rules. After a minute, the child will probably ask the main question: but why did they do it that way? And right then, the adults will feel the full weakness of civilization, because the honest answer sounds roughly like this: because grown people drew lines for many years and then decided to live as though that's normal. But Derby Line and Stansted is not only a library. There are streets where the very layout seems to wink at the era of the open border. The most famous example is Canusa Avenue, whose name already sounds like a geographer's joke. Canada and the USA merged into one word, as if the two states decided to at least be friendly on a sign. The border passes along the street, or right next to it, so close to the houses that everyday life is pressed right up against the division of states. One country on one side of the street, the other country on the other. A person can step out of their house into one legal climate glance across the road into another, and think that international politics sometimes takes the phrase neighboring state very literally. In the past, such places seemed almost proof that borders can be soft. People knew where they ran, but didn't necessarily turn every step into a ceremony. Workers, schoolchildren, families, shoppers, churchgoers, everyone lived in a space where the line was part of the landscape, like a stream or an old stone wall. But over time, the stream got fenced off, the wall was built up, and the line started demanding attention. The world grew more suspicious, and the small town got all the consequences of large fears on its skin. It's as though global politics came into a quiet kitchen, opened the fridge, frowned, and asked why the cheese wasn't stored according to protocol. The most ironic thing is that the USA and Canada are often perceived as neighbors of almost a family type. Their border is often called long, peaceful, calm, civilized. In the popular imagination, it's not a line of anxiety, but the boundary between hockey and baseball, maple syrup and apple pie, different accents and similar smiles. But Derby Line and Stansted remind us, even the most friendly border remains a border. It can be polite, well-kept, northern, with a good reputation and a decent vocabulary. But let circumstances change, and it'll quickly remember that it knows how to close. In local stories, there are many small plots that don't make it into big textbooks, but best explain the character of the place. A person heads to the library for an event, but realizes their route matters more than the event itself. A family meets not just at a building, but at a specific door, because the other door means another country. A tourist tries to take a funny photo on the line, and nearby someone gently but firmly reminds them that this is not an amusement park, but an international border. A postman, a driver, a police officer, a librarian, all become unwilling extras in a show where the set looks like a normal city, but the script was written by agencies with different seals. If Barla was the cheerful geometric embroidery of Europe, then Derby Line and Stansted is a more melancholy There, in Belgium and the Netherlands, the border played with doors and cafes almost coquettishly. Here, it looks calmer but stricter. It reminds you that even friendship between countries doesn't cancel their habit of counting entrances, exits, routes, and statuses. The library, meanwhile, remains a wonderful exception, almost a temple of common sense in the middle of a control regime. A place where a book can cross the border more easily than a person, and where a performance can connect audience and actors better than diplomatic declarations. There's something almost touching about this building. Picture an evening show. The lights go down, people whisper. Someone takes off a coat, someone looks for their seat. On the stage, located on one side of the border, the actors prepare to enter. In the hall, located on the other side, the audience stops rustling their programs. And in that moment, the border, so important during the day, so strict on the street, suddenly becomes almost invisible. It doesn't disappear. States don't simply disappear, especially when they have stamps. But for a couple of hours, it yields to a voice, a light, a gesture, a story. Art quietly does what politics has been promising for centuries. It connects people without having anyone fill out extra forms. And yet, the conclusion remains ironic. Derby Line and Stansted is a monument to human inconsistency, precisely because the border there is simultaneously friendly and suspicious, domestic and governmental, funny and anxious. It passes through a library, but doesn't become more enlightened. It passes next to houses, but doesn't become more human. It divides neighbors, but can't undo the fact that they're still neighbors. It can demand documents, but can't explain to a child why the stage and the seats should belong to different countries. This place teaches us one simple, uncomfortable thing. The absurdity of a border doesn't always shout. Sometimes it speaks in a librarian's whisper. Sometimes it sounds like the creak of wooden floorboards under the feet of a reader who just traveled from one country to another without even closing their book. Sometimes it looks like a quiet street where a neighbor's house is just a short walk away, but the state asks you to first make a detour through an official crossing. And somewhere in that detour, in that funny and sad bend of a route, is hidden the whole history of humanity's drive to turn space into an instruction manual. But ahead of us lies a border of a completely different temperament. There will be no cozy library, no velvet hall where art tries to smooth out the state line. The next stop is a place where the border runs over water, over a bridge, over islands and old treaties, so cleverly that one small patch of land changes its owner on a schedule, as if it had a seasonal job. There, sovereignty doesn't stay put. It moves like a suitcase that... Story number 6. The Island of Pheasants. A patch of land that changes hands by the calendar. After Derby Line in Stansted, where the state border politely crept into a library and sat down between the reader and the bookshelf, we're heading to a border that decided to become not a line, but a schedule. This is no longer a house divided by a door, no village drowning in enclave layers, no desert that states run from like an unpleasant bill. This is a small island on the Bidasoa River between Spain and France, so modest that a passing tourist might walk along the embankment, glance at it and think, well, an island, some trees, grass, water, nothing special. And then it turns out that this unremarkable green patch is one of the most refined bureaucratic tricks in Europe. It changes its national status every 6 months. The island of Pheasants lies between the Spanish city of Irún and the French town of Hendaye, where the Bidasoa River doesn't look like the tragic border of civilizations. It flows quietly, almost mundanely, with that watery indifference that always faintly humiliates human disputes. On the banks, houses, bridges, roads, damp Atlantic air, the cries of gulls, soft greenery, a gray sky, the smell of silt and sea. Looking from a distance, the island resembles a piece of garden that accidentally broke away from the shore and froze in the middle of the water. No palace, no fortress, no golden gates, no sentry with a halberd, no barrier that would creak like the conscience of an old diplomat. Just trees, neatly trimmed greenery, a stone edge, and silence. But this silence is deceptive. The Island of Pheasants is a condominium, territory that 2 countries not only share, but manage under a special agreement. And the most theatrical thing about it is that sovereignty over it alternates between Spain and France. For one half of the year, the island is considered Spanish, for the other half, French. It doesn't relocate, doesn't hoist sails, doesn't change the language of the birds, doesn't rearrange its rocks. It simply lies in place, and its statehood, like a very disciplined ghost, changes shifts by the calendar. If the island had a passport, it would have to be renewed with such regularity that the consulate would begin suspecting it of a nervous condition. The central strangeness of this place isn't its size, but its almost jewel-like ridiculousness. Great powers have been willing to go to war for centuries over cities, straits, mountains, colonies, mineral deposits, markets, and prestige. And here they created a delicate mechanism for a small, uninhabited island that you could walk around in the time it takes a coffee to cool. There's something of old court etiquette in this. If it's going to be absurd, then let it be absurd with seals, protocols, dates, ceremony, and the look of people who are pretending everything is absolutely normal. The states didn't say, "Who needs it anyway? Let's just make it a park." No, they said, "We will own it in turns." And somewhere at that moment, geography presumably quietly removed its hat. The Island of Pheasants became famous not because of any outstanding pheasants. The name, as often happens, sounds more impressive than the reality. Its real fame came in the mid-17th century, when the Peace of the Pyrenees was concluded there between France and Spain. This was an era when European monarchs knew how to turn negotiations into almost operatic spectacles. Wars ended not just with a signature, but with staging. Tents, retinues, coats of arms, costumes, ceremonial symmetry, important faces moving so carefully that each step seemed capable of triggering a new war. A small island in the middle of a border river was perfect for such a production. It was neither fully French nor fully Spanish, a tiny neutral stage where 2 crowns could meet without conceding the bank to each other. Try to picture that day. The river gleams coldly. Boats move on the water. Soldiers and courtiers stand on the banks. Canvas tent panels tremble in the wind. Horses snort. Boots creak on the walkways. And in the air hangs that particular smell of a historical moment. damp earth, candle wax, the leather of gloves, the memory of gunpowder, and the perfume of people who believe their family names matter more than the weather. On the tiny island, which in ordinary times might have interested only a fisherman and a couple of birds, the fate of relations between two monarchies was being decided. Europe, as always, was pretending to be rationally organized, even though it needed an island the size of a pause between two ambitions to end a war. The Peace of the Pyrenees concluded a long conflict and fixed a new balance of power. France was strengthening, Spain was gradually losing its former dominance, and the island itself became a symbol of diplomatic compromise. Later, it was tied to a dynastic plot as well, the marriage of French King Louis XIV to the Spanish Infanta Maria Teresa. This was not a romance in any modern sense, but a political knot tied with ribbons, crowns, and a dowry. In such marriages, feelings generally stood somewhere at the bottom of the list, after territory, titles, inheritance rights, the order of ceremony, and the question of who exactly was going to sit in which chair. The island of pheasants, small and silent, turned out to be the backdrop for a grand European performance in which love wore a wig and spoke the language of treaties. But the most refined strangeness began later, when the island became a symbol of joint ownership and alternating sovereignty. Today, this looks almost charming. France and Spain take turns peacefully. Nobody drags artillery there, nobody mobilizes over a shrub, nobody builds ministries on the island. In this, of course, there's a civilized appeal. Two neighboring countries found a way not to argue over a patch of land, and that way turned out to be so peculiar that it became an attraction in its own right. But that's exactly why the island seems so absurd. The compromise here has been brought to the form of an antique clockmaker's piece. Everything works, but you look at the mechanism and think, it would have been simpler just to put up a sign. The island is closed to ordinary visits, which adds to its mystique. A tourist can look at it from the bank or a bridge, photograph the trees, and try to understand what they're actually looking at. France, Spain, future Spain, former France, a territory on a 6-month trial period? In other places, a no-entry sign means private property, a military facility, or lawn repairs. Here it sounds almost metaphysical. No entry, because you're not ready for calendar sovereignty. The island seems to say, I belong to one set of people today, but don't get used to it. It's especially enjoyable to imagine the handover ceremony. No grand parade, no coronation of trees, no choir of gulls performing both national anthems in rotation. Most likely, everything happens far more dryly, more administratively, almost quietly. Representatives confirm the transfer. The documents know what they're doing. Protocol preserves dignity. But the imagination, of course, draws something else. A French official with a serious face hands a Spanish colleague the invisible key to an island that has no doors. The Spanish representative nods, as if accepting not a scrubby river islet, but an imperial province. Somewhere in the bushes, a hypothetical pheasant, if one exists at all, watches this and concludes that people are hopeless. In this place, bureaucracy doesn't look evil. It looks old-fashionedly elegant, like an elderly butler who can explain why a silver spoon must lie at a particular angle, but cannot explain why you need so many spoons in the first place. The island of pheasants is not a wound as some borders are. Not a trap like the enclaves, not a threat like closed crossings. It's more like a museum exhibit that continues performing its function. A living mechanism from an era when a sovereign's honor, the seating arrangement, and the position of the table were matters of almost cosmic importance. And yet its symbolic power shouldn't be underestimated. The border on the Bidasoa has, for centuries, been a place of contact and friction. The Basque lands on both sides of the river have their own ties, their own language, their own memory, their own roots, often deeper and more complex than state lines. For the locals, the river wasn't always a wall. It could be a road, a market, a habit, a family connection. While for states it became a convenient boundary, a place where one could say, here ends one thing and there begins another. The island in the middle of that river became the ideal stage for the question of what to do when both things are forced to look each other in the... Unlike Bir Tawil, which states turn away from, the island of pheasants is recognized by both states, but they do so in turns. Unlike Barla, where the border runs across the ground like a cat across a keyboard, Here, the border seems to have frozen on the water and become a pendulum. Unlike Derby Line, where people cross the line for books, work, and neighbors, here almost nobody crosses anything. The island itself stays motionless, while the status moves around it. And that is what makes it so elegantly ridiculous. We usually think of territory as belonging to a state. Here, it feels like the state comes to the territory in shifts, like a watchman checking the booth, making sure everything's in order, and leaving until next term. If the island were a character, it would be a quiet old man in good but slightly dated clothing. It would remember kings, peace treaties, wigs, boats, military alarms, diplomatic smiles, the changing of flags, the arrival of modern bridges, cars, tourists with phones, and officials who keep coming to it with the solemnity of people performing an ancient ritual. It wouldn't argue. It would just lie in the middle of the river and let people come back every 6 months to prove again and again that order sometimes looks like chaos. The Island of Pheasants is the best monument to human inconsistency precisely because it is simultaneously reasonable and funny. On one hand, alternating governance is an elegant way to avoid conflict. Nobody loses face, nobody gets everything, each gets exactly half the time, and diplomacy can pat itself on the back. On the other hand, the very idea of a small, uninhabited island changing nationality on a schedule sounds like a plot from a novel where the Ministry of Borders is run by someone with an excessive love of calendars. This is not a tragedy, and not a catastrophe. It's absurdity in formal wear. Looking at it from the bank, the important thing is not to expect a spectacle. There'll be no explosion, no siren, no actor stepping out to explain the moral. There'll be water, trees, stone, damp air, and a quiet realization. Before you lies a place where sovereignty isn't nailed to the ground, but turned like a page in an old diplomatic diary. And in that page-turning, there's an almost comforting thought. If states can at least occasionally share even their prestige on a schedule, then human ridiculousness doesn't always have to end in disaster. Sometimes it ends in a neat island you can't visit, and a protocol that pretends everything is under control. But further along, our route will turn from this refined diplomatic miniature toward a much harsher scene. We'll head to a place where the border runs through the frozen north, through an island that seemed particularly unnecessary to anyone, until 2 states started leaving bottles of alcohol and flags there, as if this were not a territorial dispute, but the strangest picnic in the Arctic. There, cold will be stronger than rhetoric, rocks will be more honest than diplomats, and human stubbornness will show again that even a deserted cliff. Story number 7. Hans Island, or Tartupaluk. The Arctic War where whiskey was the main weapon. After the Island of Pheasants, where sovereignty clocks in on a shift schedule, we're heading north, to a place where the very thought of human borders feels slightly presumptuous. Picture the Arctic. Cold air cuts your face like a badly sharpened knife. The sea breathes beneath the ice, heavy and slow. The horizon looks not like a line but like a verdict. Rocks lie bare, gray, with no desire whatsoever to participate in international law. There's no cozy library here, no velvet opera hall, no cafe on the Belgian-Dutch line where you can drink coffee in one country and pay. There's just a small, uninhabited island between Greenland and the Canadian island of Ellesmere, so austere and unwelcoming that even a brochure for extreme tourism would probably say, maybe try a museum instead. This island is called Hans Island, and in Greenlandic, Tartupaluk. The name sounds far more beautiful than the landscape itself. A stony Arctic spine sticking out of the cold waters of Kennedy Channel. No trees, no permanent residence, no shop, no road, no hotel with a view of the northern lights, and none of the minimal comforts that usually make people say, well, it's livable. The wind there doesn't stroll, it works. It moves around the rocks, whistles through crevices, throws icy dust, and behaves like a senior inspector checking for human arrogance. If Barlow was a border embroidery piece, Bir Tawil a desert excuse, and Gibraltar a stone political stage, then Tartupaluk resembles abandoned props from the gods, a small gray rock in a vast, cold setting. At first glance, arguing over it seems strange. What's there to divide? No city, no fertile valley, no port with noisy cranes, no vineyards, no palaces, not even a decent spot where a diplomat could place a table for signing a treaty without freezing their fingers. The island is small, bare, harsh, surrounded by icy water and long months of polar severity. If it lay in a warm sea, someone would long since have built a villa, a lighthouse, a cafe, and a souvenir shop selling magnets reading, "I crossed the strangest border." But it lies in the Arctic, where even the rocks look as if they've spent their whole lives silently enduring bad state decisions. And yet this piece of land became the occasion for one of the most unusual territorial disputes of modern times. On one side, Canada. On the other, the Kingdom of Denmark, between them, an island that both sides looked at with the expression that well-dressed people use when looking at the last chair in a negotiating room. Not particularly needed, but unpleasant to yield. The core of the dispute was almost geometric. The island lies in the strait between the Canadian and Greenlandic sides, roughly where the maritime boundary lines approached it from both directions, but didn't settle its fate definitively. In the 1970s, Canada and Denmark agreed on a substantial part of the maritime boundary, but Hans Island remained a small stone pause between the points of the agreement. The map seemed to say, "Sort this out later." And as often happens with human laters, it stretched on for decades. In a normal world, a dispute over an uninhabited Arctic rock might quickly drown in a folder marked non-urgent. But borders have a remarkable property. Even the most useless land can become a symbol if two states look at it at the same time. Hans Island was less an economic prize than a matter of principle. The Arctic isn't a void at the edge of the map, but a region of strategies, routes, resources, military attention, climate change, and national prestige. Where an ordinary person sees an icy stone, a state sees presence. And presence is already almost magic. Plant a flag, appear on a map, establish a right, leave a mark, say, "We're here." Even if here means a place where tea freezes faster than a diplomat can finish their opening remarks. And so began the famous Whiskey War, probably one of the rare international disputes that sounds like a joke, yet genuinely belongs to border history. The legendary scheme was simple and splendid in its northern absurdity. The Canadians would arrive on the island, plant their flag, and leave a bottle of Canadian whiskey. The Danes would come later, replace or remove the flag, plant their own, and leave a bottle of Danish schnapps or This was a war in which artillery was replaced by alcohol, and trenches by diplomatic humor. If all territorial disputes were settled this way, history textbooks would be thinner and border museums considerably more cheerful. Picture the scene as a film. No heroic landing to music, no tense special forces disembarkation, no captain shouting into a blizzard to hold the line. Just a small group of people on a harsh, rocky island. The wind is such that mustaches, if present, begin to question their career choices. A person in a warm jacket produces a flag, tries to fix it so the Arctic doesn't carry the national symbol off in the direction of philosophy, then places a bottle and perhaps, for a moment, smiles. In the protocol, this is called a display of sovereignty. In human translation, we came, we froze, and we left a drink. This story has an almost British dry humor to it, though the main parties are Canada and Denmark. It resembles a scene from a Wes Anderson film shot in the Arctic. A symmetrical frame, two flags, two bottles, an icy wind, serious people doing absurd things with impeccable courtesy. One crew leaves a gift. The other crew comes, removes the gift, leaves their own. No shooting, no dramatic rhetoric, no tin hitting. Just ritualized stubbornness seasoned with alcohol. Geopolitics in souvenir exchange mode. But behind that almost charming picture, it's important to see a deeper layer. Hans Island was not empty in a cultural sense, even if no houses stood on it. For the Inuit of the region, the Arctic was never the blank space that southern maps often showed. It was a space of routes, hunting, memory, seasonal passages, knowledge of ice, water, wind, and animal life. Tartupaluk is not just a rock between two state documents. It's part of a much older northern world, where territory is understood not only through flags and stamps, but through the use, experience, and connection of people to a place. And here, a quiet, important irony. States argue over sovereignty over the island, while the very region was long known by those who didn't need the European tradition of drawing thick lines to understand space. The Arctic landscape generally resists state theater. In Europe, a border can be underscored with a barrier booth, camera, a strip on the asphalt, a ceremonial flag on a facade. In the Arctic, all of that looks like temporary staging in the face of cold. A flag gets battered by the wind, metal frosts over. Footsteps disappear, tracks get buried. Even if a person arrives with a stamp, the map of nature doesn't ask to see credentials. Ice moves, water changes its face, fog descends as if someone decided to draw the curtain. And in the middle of this vast indifference, a small island becomes a stage where two civilized countries politely act out firmness. The most surprising thing is that the dispute really did end peacefully. In the early 20s of the current century, Canada, Denmark, Greenland, and representatives of Nunavut agreed on a division of the island. The line was drawn roughly along a natural cleft, and Tartupaluk became not the prize of one winner, but shared territory. So Canada and the Kingdom of Denmark ended up with a land border between them. That phrasing alone sounds like a joke geographers had been preparing for a party for a long time. Canada now borders by land not only the United States, and Denmark doesn't border only Germany, if you count the Danish kingdom through Greenland. And all of this thanks to a small Arctic island with no train station, no post office, no cafe with a view of the new international line. Picture a future tourist, if they somehow end up there in some legal and safe format, standing on gray stone, Arctic emptiness all around. The wind is trying to pull their soul out through their collar, and the guide is saying, "Congratulations, you can now cross the land border between Canada and the Kingdom of Denmark." The tourist takes a step. No barrier, no duty-free shop, no welcome sign with a cartoon bear, just stone, a crevice, cold, and the feeling that global politics sometimes has a sense of humor, but doesn't always specify the dress code. This is not a border for selfies in a light jacket. This is a border for people prepared to acknowledge that sometimes the most absurd line on a map lies where almost nobody will ever walk. And yet, in the finale of the Whiskey War, there's a rare beauty. Too many territorial disputes in history started with flags and ended in human tragedies. Here, it turned out differently. Two countries maintained the dispute for decades in an almost ritual, ironic, manageable form, and then came to an agreement. The bottles left behind became a symbol not of weakness, but of restraint. This was a dispute where states could show character without turning a rock into a tragedy. Of course, calling this a fully romantic story would also be risky. Behind it stand strategic interests, Arctic policy, law, prestige, and everything else that makes diplomacy look less like a greeting card. But it's still hard not to smile at the thought that one of the most famous border duels ended not with a cannon's roar, but with a treaty and a legend about drinks. If Hans Island could speak, it would probably say little. Arctic rocks aren't inclined to long statements. Maybe it would say something like, "You argued, planted flags, left bottles, drew lines, and all that time I was just lying in the wind." And in that would be the whole truth. Human borders often seem eternal only to people. A rock knows that eternity looks different. For it, a few decades of dispute are a brief cold caught on the surface of history. For a state, a matter of principle. For a diplomat, a folder of documents. For a journalist, a headline. For the wind, one more object to blow. Hans Island, or Tartupaluk, is the best monument to human inconsistency because everything piled up there at once. The strategic seriousness of the Arctic, the almost comical bottle exchange, the ancient significance of northern lands for the Inuit, modern law, national pride, and the tiny size of the object of dispute. This place reminds us that a state can be simultaneously adult and childlike. Adult, when it spends decades negotiating, formalizing borders, accounting for the interests of autonomous regions and indigenous peoples. Childlike, when it doesn't want to yield a rock where even a picnic requires heroic logistics. And maybe that's exactly why this story fits so well into our route through the geography of absurdity. Here, the absurdity is not cruel, not domestic, not suffocating like the enclave labyrinths, and not desert legal like Birtawil. It's cold, dry, almost noble. This is absurdity in a wool hat, with a windburned face and a bottle left by a flag. It stands at the edge of the world and says, look, people can argue even where there's almost nothing to share, but sometimes they do know when to stop. And next, we'll leave the Arctic rock and head to a border where the absurdity will be not icy, but urban, almost claustrophobic. Ahead is a place where one country for decades owned a tiny fortified enclave inside another, where barracks, walls, passageways, and a foreign city all around turned politics into permanent tension. There, the border won't be on an island or a river. It will be squeezed directly into the fabric of a city. Like Story number 8, the Kowloon Walled City. The ghost city inside a city, where the border became a hole in the law. After icy Tartapaluk, where states left bottles by flags and pretended the Arctic was a diplomatic salon with poor heating, we dive into a completely different climate, humid, dense, electric. Before us, Hong Kong. Not the postcard of skyscrapers in a bay, not the glossy facade of a financial world, but a dark urban fold where for decades one of the most famous anomalies in border history lived. There were no white crosses on the pavement here, as in Barl, no desert silence as in Birtawil, no solemn alternating sovereignty by calendar as on the island of Pheasants. Here there was a hole, not geographical but legal. A small fortified plot that remained Chinese by right, ended up inside British Hong Kong by fact, and turned into a city where authority itself seemed afraid to enter without a torch. From the outside, the Kowloon Walled City didn't look like a classic border. No boundary post, no neat line, no booth where a uniformed person asks your purpose of travel and looks at you as though you personally invented smuggling. It looked like a monstrously dense block composed of concrete chunks, rusty grills, external pipes, laundry lines, signs, wires, and windows staring into windows. If a normal city breathes through streets, the walled city breathed through cracks. If a normal building has a facade, here the facade was a crust on an organism that had long since stopped distinguishing where one building ended and the next began. Looking at old photographs of the walled city, you get the feeling someone took a metropolis, clenched it in a fist, and put it out to dry next to an airport. Tall, closely fused buildings stood so densely that daylight entering the inner passages quickly lost confidence in itself. Narrow corridors smelled of noodles, damp, hot oil, plastic, old pipes, tobacco, medicine, wet concrete, and human life of which there was far too much in far too little space. Overhead, fans hummed, water dripped, neon signs buzzed. Somewhere a machine clicked in a small workshop. Somewhere a dentist worked. Somewhere soup was being made. Somewhere a child did homework at a table that in a few minutes would be used for counting money. This was not just a place, it was an overheated process. Originally, however, things looked far more modest. A Chinese military post connected with coastal surveillance and the salt trade existed here in the 19th century. After Britain received Hong Kong Island, the Qing authorities strengthened the position in Kowloon to maintain their presence beside the expanding British territory. Stone walls, gates, a yamen, an administrative building, military function, officials, a garrison, the full set of old border theater. This was not the future cyberpunk slum, but an imperial outpost, harsh and relatively understandable. The walls were real, the authority was declared, the purpose was clear. Historical accounts of the walled city connect its development to the Qing military fortification, strengthened in the mid-19th century after the arrival of British rule on Hong Kong Island. Then came the treaty that created the central absurdity. When Britain obtained the new territories on lease at the end of the 19th century, the walled city was excluded from that transfer. Chinese officials were, by agreement, permitted to remain there, provided they didn't interfere with the defense of British Hong Kong. The very formula already sounds like an invitation to future catastrophe. A piece of Chinese jurisdiction surrounded by a British colonial system. a small legal island inside a large administrative sea. On paper, this probably looked like an elegant caveat. On the ground, like a slow-burning mine. Only instead of an explosion, it produced decades of gray zone. Historical information about the city notes that the lease of the new territories left the fortress outside the lease, preserving Chinese presence under restrictive conditions. The British soon entered the fortress. Chinese official structures effectively disappeared. The Qing Empire collapsed. Japanese occupation during the war destroyed the old walls, the stone used to expand Kai-Tak Airport, and after the war, the site began filling with people whom the city received not in grand halls, but in cracks. And here is where the real metamorphosis begins. A military outpost transforms into an illegal megastructural anthill that formally belongs to nobody completely, but in practice belongs to those capable of surviving in it, building in it, negotiating, pulling teeth, frying food, making plastic toys, and raising a concrete floor on top of a concrete floor. Sources note that the walls were dismantled by the Japanese authorities during the war, and after the war, the fortress became a territory with extremely weak governance and dense construction. The walled city became not so much a state within a state as the negation of a state at the heart of a state. Britain didn't want to fully intervene because the legal status remained sensitive. China long pressed its claims but didn't manage the daily life of the quarter. The result was a space where official power resembled a flickering light bulb, apparently existing, but try reading in that light. Police went in there, but not the way they'd enter a normal neighborhood. City standards applied strangely. Building regulations were more of a rumor. Sanitation ran on improvisation, and the architecture grew upward and sideways with the determination that mold displays in a forgotten basement. Here it's especially important not to turn the walled city into a cheap myth about a city of criminals. Yes, its reputation was heavy. Yes, triads operated there, along with illegal establishments, gambling dens, drug points, and underground practices. All the things that like to grow in places where authority is simultaneously close and far. But looking only at that gives us a caricature, convenient for films but unfair to the people who lived there. Because inside this concrete forest there was not only shadow but also everyday life. Families, schools, shops, workshops, doctors, cooks, children, old people, neighbors, shared staircases, small altars, the smell of dinner, arguments over leaks, conversations on the landings, helping each other, trying to build a normal life where the very layout said, "Normal life not included." The walled city was simultaneously a frightening legend and a home. The density there was almost unimaginable. On a plot of roughly a few hectares lived tens of thousands of people. Old descriptions often cite an area of around 2.5 hectares and a population of around 35,000 people toward the beginning of the last decade of the city's existence. Those words are easy to read and forget, but try entering mentally. A few hectares isn't a city. It's a quarter whose breathing you can hear from one end to the other. Now put tens of thousands of lives inside it. Each room becomes a universe. Each corridor a street, each staircase a thoroughfare, each wire a nerve, each pipe an artery. Historical information about the walled city gives an area of approximately 2.6 hectares and a population of approximately 35,000 people shortly before demolition. Aircraft from Kai-Tak Airport came in low over the fortress. That's a separate layer of madness. Picture a city where engines roar above the rooftops, where concrete boxes stretch upward but can't grow endlessly because of the airport, where the sky belongs to planes and the ground to people who are forced to build ever denser, deeper, tighter. The sound of a plane passed over the quarter like a mechanical god. First a distant rumbling, then a growing roar, then vibrations in the windows and cups, then again a damp pause. In a science fiction film, this would be an anti-utopia. In reality, someone at that moment was cutting vegetables, someone was waiting for a customer, someone was washing their hair over a basin, someone was arguing about a leak, and someone had simply gotten used to it. The inner passages of the fortress were often described as a labyrinth, but the word labyrinth is too clean, too museum-like. The Minotaur's labyrinth at least had a blueprint. The walled city was more like the intestine of a city, narrow, alive, winding, dark, full of smells, sudden doors, staircases, turns, Pipes, drips, light from rooms, strangers' voices through the wall. In some places, daylight barely reached the ground, and people lived in perpetual twilight, where time was determined not by the sun, but by the noise of work, the opening of shops, the arrival of customers, and the smell of food. A neon sign here could be more important than a window, because the window looked into a neighbor's wall. The architecture of the fortress was the result of almost pure self-construction, not in the romantic sense of people building the city of their dreams, but in the hard sense. People built because they needed somewhere to live, and the state preferred uncertainty. Floors accumulated, structures merged, staircases connected the unforeseen with the impossible. Rooftops became roots, plumbing and electricity were strung as best they could. This was a city assembled not by architects, but by necessity. If Le Corbusier dreamed of a machine for living, the walled city was a machine for surviving, assembled at night from other people's parts, without instructions, with a suspiciously smoking engine. A particularly strange layer of life was the small-scale production and services. The fortress was known for workshops, food production, unlicensed dentists and doctors, shops, barber shops, gaming rooms, all the things that spring up when demand is high, control is weak, and people know how to turn any corner into a workspace. Tourist fantasy likes to imagine eternal darkness and danger there. But for many residents, it was above all the economics of proximity. Need something fixed? Here's a craftsman. Need food? Here's noodles. Need a tooth fixed? Here's a cabinet. Perhaps not one the ministry would endorse, but a toothache, as is known, has poor understanding of licensing. Bureaucracy can argue about authority for a long time. A bad tooth demands a solution by evening. And here the absurdity becomes almost philosophical. A state usually justifies itself with a promise of order. It knows where to build, who pays, who heals, who inspects, who's responsible, where the border runs, and what rules apply. The walled city was a place where that promise fell through the gap between two sovereignties. It showed that the absence of clear authority doesn't create freedom in a romantic sense. It creates a survival market, where some people find opportunities, some find protection in communities, some become vulnerable, and the environment itself thickens to the limit. This is not an anarchic utopia or simply a criminal hell. It's a warning. When states argue too long about who has the right to be responsible, the walls, the pipes, the money, the neighbors, and the most powerful local structures start being responsible instead. In the 1980s, the fate of the fortress was sealed. British and Chinese authorities agreed on demolition. Relocations began, compensation was arranged, difficult negotiations with residents took place, protests, discontent, a long process of parting with a place that for the outside world was a nightmare, but for many inside was the only home. Plans to demolish the fortress were announced in the late 1980s. Demolition began in the early 1990s and was completed in the mid-90s. A park was later opened in its place, where the yamen and remnants of the South Gate were preserved as monuments to a vanished world. The demolition scene, if imagined cinematically, should be not only loud but strangely empty. The concrete that for decades held thousands of lives begins to disappear under the blows of machinery. Rooms open outward, like boxes with other people's secrets. Where laundry hung yesterday, today there's dust. Where soup was cooked, now rebar is visible. Where a child knew every step, a construction machine leaves a smooth emptiness. No need for naturalistic drama. It's enough to understand that what was disappearing was not just a neighborhood, but an entire form of existence generated by legal uncertainty. Today, in the place of the walled city, there is a park, quiet, tidy, arranged along the lines of a Chinese garden, with paths, pavilions, greenery, a restored yamen, and archaeological remnants of the gates. This is an almost ideal final gesture of bureaucracy. First, allow a legal loophole to turn into the densest human hive imaginable. Then demolish it, plant grass, put up labels, and make the place suitable for a peaceful stroll. The park is beautiful, no question, but in its tidiness there's something slightly unsettling, as if the city said, "We fixed everything," when in reality it just laid turf over a memory. The Kowloon walled city is the best monument to human inconsistency, because it was born not from one decision but from a chain of things left unsaid. One treaty left an exception. One empire weakened, another authority didn't want to take full responsibility. War destroyed the walls. The post-war city received refugees and need. A legal dispute became construction density. And then, this entire concrete organism became so famous that people began perceiving it as myth, almost like a real level from a video game, where cyberpunk wasn't yet an aesthetic, but was the smell of a damp corridor. The irony is that the fortress was called a fortress even after its old walls had disappeared. The real walls became not stone but uncertainty, poverty, the fear of eviction, the absence of proper governance, and the habit of living inside an exception. The state border here didn't run along the floor like in the Haskell Library, didn't divide an island like on Tartupaluk. It became a void in the law, and the void, as it turned out, also knows how to build cities. But our route goes further. After Kowloon, where a border became a shadow between empires and produced a vertical labyrinth, we're heading to a place where the absurdity will be not Asian and not urban, but almost European rural. There, the line between states once divided streets, yards, and fates so closely that one wrong step could turn a walk into an international. Story number 9. The Vennbahn. The railway that stole pieces of Germany from Germany itself. After the walled city, where the border became a hole in the law and built itself a concrete labyrinth, you'd want to step outside. Preferably somewhere it's not dripping from the ceiling, fans aren't humming, windows aren't looming. Somewhere the horizon at least occasionally resembles normal space. And so we find ourselves in the Eifel, on soft hills between Belgium and Germany. It smells of damp forest, wet grass, bark, bicycle rubber, village smoke, and coffee, which in this story will sound not like a drink, but like an almost criminal character. On the surface, idyll. A road disappears between trees. Old railway embankments have overgrown with greenery. Former stations look out at the world with tired brick self-importance. Cyclists roll along the route so calmly that you'd think they're cycling not through a former geopolitical trap, but along a postcard of European unity. But don't relax. The Vennbahn is the kind of case where the tracks were long since removed, the train departed, the steam dissolved, but the border stayed lying on the ground like a forgotten snake. Before us is a former railway line once built by the Prussian railways, but after the First World War, transferred to Belgian territory along with the trackbed, stations, and infrastructure. This turned several areas of Germany to the west of the line into German exclaves surrounded by Belgium. Today, a significant part of the route exists as a cycle path, and the official tourism project describes the Vennbahn as one of the longest cross-border railway cycling routes in Europe, running through Germany, Belgium, and Luxembourg. At first, everything looks too peaceful. Picture a former railway, a flat strip of asphalt, trees on either side, occasionally an old station, occasionally a bridge, occasionally a sign whose name sounds as though it was invented by someone who loved both German consonants and Belgian patience. Cyclists whisper past on their tires. Somewhere a tourist's stick taps on gravel. In the fog, pastures appear. Fences, village rooftops, well-behaved cows, a forest that regards borders as a mild administrative misunderstanding. No dramatic checkpoint, no soldiers, no siren. Just the line of a former track that looks so innocent you want to forgive it everything in advance. A mistake, because this very line staged one of the most elegantly ridiculous border tricks in Europe. After the war, Belgium received the eastern territories important to it, and, along with them, secured control of the Vennbahn, since the railway was economically and strategically significant for the Eupen and Malmedy region. But the railway didn't obediently run inside a single country. It crossed what would become the border the way an old train crosses a landscape, without asking politicians whether it was convenient. As a result, the trackbed itself was recognized as Belgian, while the German lands on the other side of the rails found themselves cut off from main Germany. So a border paradox appeared. Belgium received a long, narrow ribbon of former railway, and Germany received several of its own territories now reachable only by going through a foreign state. In a normal world, a railway connects. The Vennbahn divided. Rails usually link mines, factories, cities, markets, stations, families, and suitcases. Here, rails became scissors. They neatly cut off German villages and plots, as though some supernatural railway worker had decided, no passengers today, but there will be an enclave comedy. The width of the former track in some places is negligible compared to the scale of the consequences. A narrow strip of land and, if you can believe it, a few chunks of Germany end up completely surrounded by Belgium. This isn't some great wall we're talking about. It's a great railway right-of-way, forgotten between the pages of an international treaty. The most beautiful thing about this whole absurdity is how quietly rural it looks. The Vennbahn exclave settlements don't look like sets from a spy thriller. They're not islands in the ocean, not fortresses, not disputed deserts, not closed-off zones with spotlights everywhere. These are villages, fields, forests, warehouse buildings, homes, roads, little settlements where, in the morning, people take out the trash, fix fences, go shopping, and probably don't stop every single time to think, you know, I live in a geographical quirk that was dreamed up as a consequence of the Treaty of Versailles. Among these German patches, people usually name Mützenich, Rückschlag, Rützhof, Münsterbildchen, and Rödgenawald. There used to be more of them, but after post-war exchanges and clarifications, 5 remained. Try to picture Rückschlag, the most almost comical of these fragments. The name in German can be translated as setback or backlash, and it's hard to come up with a more fitting name for a place that itself looks like a map playing a prank on a nation. We're literally talking about a small plot with a house and a garden, German by ownership and Belgian in terms of everything surrounding it geographically. If Barla bet on a doorstep, the Vennbahn bets on the bed of former rails. And somewhere between these two examples comes the feeling that Europe is not a continent, but a very old table on which generations of officials left rulers, stamps, coffee stains, and lines that were never quite fully erased. Historically, everything started out pretty pragmatically. The Vennbahn was built for an industrial world. Coal, iron, the movement of raw materials, connections between Aachen, Eupen, Malmedy, Trois-Ponts, and other points in the region. It was a railway from an era when a steam locomotive seemed not just a machine, but a promise of progress. Smoke, the clatter of wheels, wet railway sleepers, the lantern of a station watchman, coal dust on shirt sleeves, a whistle cutting through the morning over the hills. But then big politics arrived, and what had been built for industry became an instrument of borders. The Versailles decisions made the route Belgian, first temporarily, then permanently, and a former Prussian line turned into a thin territorial ribbon along which Germany unexpectedly lost pieces of itself. There's something almost Kafkaesque about this scene. A German farmer looks at his house, his field, his forest, his road. And everything seems German: the language, the address, the habits, the local administration, conversations about football, church bells. But between him and the main body of Germany lies a Belgian strip of former railway. No wall, no river, no sea, no army, just a former track bed, the territory of a neighboring state. For geography to become absurd, it doesn't always need a grand gesture. Sometimes all it takes is a strip of land the width of a railway corridor and a treaty written with the complete confidence that the consequences would somehow sort themselves out. Imagine the old border landscape of the Vennbahn. Along the embankment stand boundary stones, small, stubborn, covered in moss and time. Some carry Belgian markings, others carry German memory. Nearby is a forest where branches scrape the air. The boggy sections of the high fens breathe dampness, and a path disappears into the fog as if it doesn't want to answer which country it's in. Trains used to run here with their metallic rhythm, and a passenger probably didn't even notice that their carriage was crossing not just a landscape, but a future legal trap. Wheels clattered, the conductor checked tickets, someone looked out the window, and underneath them, a script for border surrealism was slowly being written. After the Second World War, the Vennbahn became Belgian again, and the German exclave settlements got their strange life back. This is where coffee enters the story, not as a cozy drink for a Sunday morning, but as a hero of the border economy. In the post-war years, along the German-Belgian border, smuggling flourished, especially of coffee, because taxes and prices made it far more expensive in Germany. Mützenich, a German village, became one of the centers of these routes. Local tourist materials directly connect the bronze statue of a smuggler near the old customs house to the post-war years of coffee smuggling, when the Vennbahn turned the village into a German island inside Belgian encirclement. This is where the landscape shifts. No longer just bicycles, forests, and old stations. Now there's night, dampness, narrow paths, branches hitting your arms. A lantern may flash in the distance. A person walks with a load of coffee that smells simultaneously of salvation, income, and a criminal charge. Somewhere nearby, a customs officer is listening to the forest. In an ordinary thriller, smugglers carry gold, weapons, secret microfilm, or at least diamonds hidden in a shoe heel. Here, coffee is the great black engine of European illegality. If Bridge of Spies had been filmed in the Eiffel, the main exchange wouldn't involve a briefcase full of documents, but a sack of beans, after which all parties involved would look just a little more alert. Bureaucracy itself set the stage for this spectacle. When a border turns into a winding cord, when one village sits in one country while everything around it belongs to another, and an old railway strip belongs to a third kind of logic, people inevitably get the feeling that rules can be navigated just as cleverly as a forest path. The state says, "Here is the line." The residents look at it and think, the line is absolutely respected, but the coffee isn't going to carry itself. This isn't romanticizing smuggling. It's an understanding of how absurd geography creates absurd temptations. When the system looks like a puzzle, a person starts behaving like a player. And yet the Vennbahn isn't just a story of clever folk and customs officers. It's a story of how infrastructure can outlive its own purpose. The rails were removed, the trains left. The line's industrial role faded. Tourist trains became a memory too, but the border stayed. At some point, there were even discussions about whether the former right-of-way territory should return to Germany if the railway no longer functioned. However, the positions of the parties confirmed that the former trackbed remains Belgian territory, and the German exclave settlements continue to exist. And so the Vennbahn became almost a philosophical object. There's no railway, but its legal ghost keeps on separating chunks of Germany from Germany. A modern cyclist rolling along the Vennbahn might not feel any of this. They have a water bottle, a helmet, a route map, a phone, possibly an overly confident sense of their own physical fitness, and a romantic thought about how lovely it is to ride through Europe without borders. They cross sections of Germany, Belgium, and Luxembourg, admire the landscape, photograph an old station, buy a waffle, check the navigation, and beneath them runs the former line, reminding them that the absence of a barrier doesn't mean the absence of history. Today you can ride here calmly because Europe has learned to soften many of its internal borders, but the shape of those borders hasn't gone anywhere. It's just become more convenient for bicycle tires. The most ironic detail about the Vennbahn is that it has turned into a tourist symbol of open Europe, even though it was born as one of its strangest border seams. The very thing that once created exclave settlements, customs curiosities, confusion, and fertile ground for smuggling is now sold as a route through landscape, history, and border atmosphere. This is beautiful, and a little suspicious. Bureaucracy first breaks space apart, then history grows drama around it, then tourism neatly puts up an information board. And now a person photographs the very thing that their great-grandfather might have been hiding coffee bags over. States have a remarkable business acumen for turning their own mistakes into tourist attractions. If you listen to the Vennbahn on a foggy day, you can almost hear its old voice. Not the loud blast of a steam engine, but something lower and more hidden. The clatter of wheels, the footsteps of border guards, the whispers of smugglers, the creak of freight wagons, conversations at stations, the rustle of treaty pages being signed in capitals by people who had no idea about future rural cycling routes. The forest has absorbed all of it. Moss on the stones, old embankments, bridges, rail traces, station names. Everything holds the memory of how a line of transport became a line of sovereignty, and then a line of recreation. The Vennbahn is the finest monument to human inconsistency, because it shows that even the most practical object can become a metaphysical problem if you fence it in with law at the right moment. The railway was built to bring in coal and iron. Then it was used to consolidate control over territory. Then it produced German exclave settlements. Then it became a smuggling route. Then it died as a railway. Then it was reborn as a cycling path. And through all of this, the border behaved like an old accountant. I'm sorry, but the documents say exactly this. In Barl, the border entered a house. In Bir Tawil, states walked away from a desert. In Kuch Bahar, villages lived inside a matryoshka. In Gibraltar, a rock held imperial memory. In Derby Line, a library became an international attraction. On Pheasant Island, sovereignty walked a calendar. On Tartu's bank, flags argued with the wind and bottles. In Cologne, a legal shadow built a city. And the Vennbahn quietly proves that sometimes all it takes is one railway for a country to find itself not quite next to itself. And if you ever travel this route, don't rush. Listen to the swish of tires. Look at the forest, the old stations, the boundary stones, the signs, the calm villages. Remember that beneath this idyll lies one of the strangest administrative stories in Europe. The cyclist sees a road. The geographer sees a ribbon of Belgian territory. The lawyer sees the consequences of a treaty. The historian hears a train. And a good guide to absurd borders also sees an invisible official who still stands beside the former trackbed and says with an expressionless face, "The rails have been removed, but sovereignty, please don't touch that." But ahead of us lies a border that is even more theatrical and almost pocket-sized. We'll head to a place where a small town ended up as a Spanish island inside a French landscape, where the road home runs through a foreign country and where a medieval treaty keeps working with the stubbornness of an old notary. The mountains there will be beautiful, the air clear, the streets calm. But behind this idyll, once again, will come the question that makes the map nervously twitch at its corners. How can a city possibly be? Story number 10. Yivia, a Spanish town forgotten inside the French mountains. After the Vennbahn, where an old railway so cleverly cut pieces of Germany away from Germany itself that even the removed rails couldn't cancel its border magic, we climb up into the Pyrenees. The air here gets thinner, cleaner, colder, as if it had been filtered in advance through stone, snow, and centuries. Roads curve between slopes, villages cling to valleys, rooftops darken after rain, and the mountains look down at people with the impassive contempt that eternity usually reserves for cadastral disputes. At first glance, everything seems almost too beautiful for our collection of absurdities. Alpine quiet, stone houses, a church tower, narrow streets, the smell of firewood, cheese, damp earth, and coffee, which, in mountain air, seems not like a drink but a legitimate means of survival. And there, in the middle of this Pyrenean postcard, stands Yivia, a small Spanish town completely surrounded by France. Not metaphorically surrounded, not culturally, not historically drawn toward it. Completely, from every direction. Spain doesn't approach the town with a broad shoulder of territory, doesn't wrap it in a border, doesn't touch it in the usual way. Yivia lies there like a Spanish coin that accidentally rolled under a French rug, and for several centuries now, nobody has been able to convincingly explain to the rug that the coin should go back into the wallet. From the outside, Yivia doesn't throw a tantrum. It doesn't shout, "Look at me, I'm an enclave." It doesn't put a theatrical barrier at every corner, doesn't keep a border guard at the entrance with the face of someone personally protecting European logic from final collapse. The town lives quietly, almost stubbornly. Stone facades, balconies, squares, a pharmacy, a cafe, tourists in jackets, local residents talking about the weather with the look of people who long ago understood that state geography is no reason to be late for lunch. But behind this calm surface hides one of those stories that makes you want to ask the map, are you sure you can be trusted? To get from mainland Spain to Yivia, you have to cross France. That sounds like the beginning of a bad joke, but for locals it was simply a route for a long time. The road runs through French territory, and in this everyday movement the full charm of the absurdity reveals itself. Imagine that your country is behind a neighboring country, but your home is still formally home. You drive to Spain, from Spain, through France in order to get to Spain. The navigation system announces this in a calm electronic voice, as if it sees nothing undignified to the human mind in what's happening. At this point, Kafka, if he were alive, would probably throw out the navigator and go on foot, because even it would have become too obvious. The history of Yevia doesn't begin with modern European integration, not with tourist brochures and not with cheerful photos at road signs. It goes deep into the Middle Ages, when settlements, titles, and rights had an almost magical power, and every word in the treaty could, centuries later, turn into a geographical landmine. Yevia was an important place in the Cerdan, a mountain region divided between the Spanish and French sides of the Pyrenees. Then came the Treaty of the Pyrenees, that same great diplomatic knot between France and Spain that we already heard as background noise on Pheasant Island. Under the terms of the agreements, Spain ceded to France a number of settlements in the northern part of the Cerdan. It seems simple enough. The villages go to France, the line becomes clearer, diplomats satisfactorily wipe their quills, the seals dry. But a detail arose in the treaty that deserves its own candle in the temple of bureaucratic absurdity. What was being transferred were villages specifically, and Yevia held the status of a town, not a village, a town. And that status became a shield, thin as paper but firm as the stubbornness of a lawyer. The Spanish side retained Yevia because it formally wasn't on the list of villages being transferred. As a result, the surrounding lands became French while Yevia remained Spanish. One word, one status, one distinction between village and town. And just like that, a small Spanish capsule appeared on the map inside France. This is where one wants to pause and observe a moment of silence for common sense, because nothing demonstrates the power of bureaucracy quite as well as a city that remained in one country thanks to having been called the wrong word in time to prevent its transfer to another. This wasn't a great wall, not a heroic defense, not an epic battle. It was the victory of a clerical noun. If states were comedy characters, Spain at this moment would have pulled out a document, tapped a finger on the wording and said, "Excuse me, gentlemen, but this is a town." And France would probably have looked at the map, the mountains, the road, the whole future enclave, and thought something very undiplomatic. So Yevia became a Spanish exclave, and its life turned into a quiet but constant reminder that treaties love to outlive the circumstances they were written for. Medieval and early modern statuses, royal decisions, local privileges, diplomatic formulations, all of this usually seems like dust in archives. But here, the archive walked out onto the street. It turned into a road sign, a postal address, a question of police jurisdiction, school affiliation, who clears the road in winter, and what rules apply around the next bend. Particularly expressive is the road itself, from Spain to Yevia. Today it seems normal, convenient, almost invisible thanks to European openness. But for many years, the path to the exclave was a matter of a special arrangement. The road through French territory had to be negotiated, protected, clarified, because a town can't live normally if access to it depends on a neighbor's mood. This isn't just a road, it's an umbilical cord, a narrow one, laid through a neighboring state, necessary to prevent a Spanish town inside France from turning into a museum of peculiar legal stubbornness. The road here resembles a corridor in a hotel where your room is inexplicably in a different building under a different jurisdiction, but the receptionist assures you that everything is perfectly convenient. Imagine a winter morning. Snow lies on the slopes, the air rings, cars move carefully along the road, headlights blurring in the cold fog. Somewhere a driver is carrying groceries, someone is heading to school, someone to the doctor, someone to work. They cross French territory not because they decided to make an international journey, but because there's no other way to get to their own Spanish town. In the trunk are ordinary things: bread, milk, tools, a child's backpack, shopping bags. But the geography itself adds to this ordinariness a faint scent of diplomatic farce. The person doesn't feel like the hero of a spy film, but their route is such that the screenwriter was clearly making an effort. The town, meanwhile, doesn't look like a besieged Spanish outpost. Yevia has no feeling that its residents wake up every day thinking, "We're surrounded." Quite the opposite. The being surrounded has become part of the local character, like mountain air or a habit of winter. Here, Catalan identity, Spanish administrative belonging, French surroundings, and Pyrenean everyday life weave into a fabric that can't be cut with a single straight line. A person can live in Spain, drive into France for groceries, speak Catalan, look at mountains that couldn't care less about any treaty, and consider all of this not a paradox, but a normal environment. A particular pride of Yvia is the old pharmacy, one of those cultural objects that suddenly turns a small town into a place with its own weighty memory. The pharmacy feels like a perfect metaphor for the entire exclave. Inside, antique cabinets, vessels, herbs, pharmaceutical history, a neat order of medicines and prescriptions. Outside, a town that is itself a remedy against excessive confidence in the simplicity of borders. Yvia seems to say, here's an ointment for imperial overconfidence. Apply externally, spread thinly across the map. In places like these, it's especially clear that borders rarely align with life. On the map, France surrounds it. Spain sits inside. The lines are clear. The statuses are written down. And in reality, people drive, trade, talk, marry, work, argue about parking, choose schools, complain about prices, watch the weather forecast, and don't organize a philosophical seminar about the nature of sovereignty every single day. The state likes to think in large categories: territory, jurisdiction, treaty, sovereignty, right of access. The resident thinks differently: how to get there faster, where groceries are cheaper, who's picking up the kid today, why they're fixing the road again, and whether it will snow by evening. And yet, the absurdity periodically seeps through the cracks of everyday life. Imagine an official who needs to explain Yvia's status to someone seeing the map for the first time. It's a Spanish town. All right. It's located in France. How so? It's surrounded by France. Then it must be French? No, Spanish. Why? Because it was a town, not a village. At this point, the other person looks at you the way people look when you've just retold the plot of a film where the main character wins a court case thanks to a comma. But that's often how history works. Not a majestic flow of events, but a very expensive comma that nobody noticed in time. One can also imagine an old border guard from an era when regimes were stricter. He stands at the side of the road, his uniform smelling of wool, rain, and tobacco. His boots are covered in mud. The booth is cold. There's a thermos on the table, a journal beside it with too many surnames and too few answers. In front of him is a car with Spanish plates, driving through France to a Spanish town. He checks the documents with the expression of a man who gave up being surprised long ago, but hasn't yet forgiven the world for it. The barrier rises, the car drives on, and somewhere between the click of the stamp and the squeak of metal, the quiet laughter of history can be heard. Livia is particularly fine because its strangeness doesn't look aggressive. It doesn't threaten, it doesn't press. It rather peeks quietly from around a mountain bend. There's no sense of tragic rupture here, as in some borders where lines divided families and villages. Here the absurdity has been domesticated. It lives in road signs, in museum stories, in the status of a town that turned out stronger than geographical logic. In the fact that to drive from one Spanish space to another, you have to pass through a French one. It's almost a comedy of errors. Only the roles were distributed by monarchs, diplomats, and notaries. And the show has been running for several centuries. But beneath this gentle irony lies a serious meaning. Livia reminds us that the state map is not a natural fact, but the result of negotiations, formulas, compromises, mistakes, pride, and sometimes pure chance. We've gotten used to looking at countries as if they grew out of the earth on their own, like mountains. But mountains, unlike borders, don't need a signature. Livia exists because once upon a time the word town turned out to be stronger than the desire to make a line neat. In a world where millions of people depend on exactly how a document is worded, this isn't a small thing. It's a lesson with stone streets and a Pyrenean sky. If you walk through Livia in the evening, when the light in the windows turns warm and the mountains go dark, the strangeness almost disappears. A square, conversations, the clatter of dishes, footsteps on stone, a car slowly turning a corner, a dog that doesn't recognize international complications and barks with purely local confidence. But the moment you lift your eyes to the map in your head, everything comes back. France all around, Spain underfoot, the Pyrenees overhead. In the past, a treaty where the fate of a place was decided by a formulation. In the present, an ordinary life that learned to walk over an old legal sleight of hand, as naturally as if nothing strange were happening at all. Yevia is the finest monument to human inconsistency because it proves that sometimes the strangeness of a border is born not from war, not from some great strategic dispute, not from a desert, not from an airport, and not from a railway, but from the status of a settlement. Villages were handed over. The town was kept. And there you have it, a small Spanish island in a French mountain sea. Calm, beautiful, stubborn, living as though logic should adapt to it rather than the other way around. This place doesn't need to be understood as a mistake. It's more of a reminder that history never quite finishes editing it. It leaves notes in the margins, strange exceptions, old formulas that keep working even though the world around them changed long ago. Yevia is one such note, a small footnote to the Treaty of the Pyrenees, written in stone, road, and stubborn civic dignity. But ahead lies our final stop, and it will be a special one. After villages, islands, deserts, railways, libraries, rocks, and ghost cities, we're headed to a border that resembles not a line and not an enclave, but a pure philosophical jab at the very concept of statehood. There, a person can stand in a place where countries converge so tightly that common sense starts asking for a vacation. There, a tiny territory, grand ambitions, and old treaties will once again prove, if people want to complicate a map, all they need is a pen and a seal. Story number 11. Neutral Moresnet, the state that was never quite finished. After Yevia, that Spanish town that survived inside France thanks to the power of a single bureaucratic word, our journey arrives at its final point, and it's worthy of a curtain call. We climb to a place where today Belgium, Germany, and the Netherlands meet, to hills, roads, forests, tourist signs, and viewing platforms where people photograph themselves with the joyful look of someone who has just caught Europe by the sleeve. From the outside, it's an ordinary, tidy border area. Damp grass, neat paths, cyclists, families with children, the smell of waffles, forest dampness, and hot coffee from a kiosk. It seems like we're about to be shown a good-natured European attraction. Here's one country, here's another, here's a third. Please step up to the line, smile, don't drop your ice cream. But beneath this tourist-friendly surface lies a story so elegantly ridiculous that it resembles the draft of a state that accidentally lived for more than a century. Once, near the current three-country point, there existed neutral Moresnet, a tiny territory between Prussia and the Netherlands, later between Prussia and Belgium, created because two neighbors couldn't agree on who would get a valuable zinc mine. The territory was only a few kilometers long, covering roughly 3.5 square kilometers, but its legal biography was richer than that of many kingdoms with palaces, armies, and portraits of monarchs in heavy frames. Historical accounts describe neutral Moresnet as a small Belgian-Prussian condominium that existed from the early 19th century until the post-war reshaping under the Treaty of Versailles. It all began after the fall of Napoleon, when Europe, somewhat worn out by wars, decided to lay itself out on the table again and draw borders as if this time it would manage to do it neatly. The Congress of Vienna, treaties, commissions, maps, quills, ink, the faces of men confident in their own historical importance. Prussia and the new Kingdom of the Netherlands had to draw a border in the Moresnet area. Most of the line was agreed on without much drama, but then the Vieille Montagne, or Altenburg mine, stepped onto the stage, rich in zinc ore. And right there, all the diplomatic music fell apart. The land had suddenly stopped being just land. It had become income, raw material, industry, future money, which is precisely the thing that makes statesmen suddenly start talking about principles with especially bright eyes. The solution was found in the style of someone who couldn't divide a pie and therefore declared the central piece temporarily philosophical. The territory of Moresnet was split into 3 parts. One went to the Netherlands, another to Prussia, and the middle section, where the mine was located, became a neutral zone under joint administration. This was not an independent country in the full sense, but also not an ordinary part of any neighboring state. More of a legal waiting room, where the chairs had been set out, the lamp turned on, but no sign had ever been put on the door. The assumption was, presumably, that at some point, grown-up people would return and resolve the question conclusively. The grown-up people, as usual, didn't return in time. On the ground, neutral Morsnet looked not like a fantastical kingdom, but like a workers' settlement built around an industrial heart. The mine and the Vieille Montagne Company defined the life of the territory almost as strongly as crowns and commissars. There were houses, shops, roads, schools, workshops, miners, families, tired people in work clothes, carts, smoke, the metallic smell of ore, the dampness of underground workings, and that particular industrial noise that reminds you, statehood is statehood, but the shift starts early. Life in Morsnet revolved not around a palace or a parliament, but around extraction. If other countries had their heartbeat in capital cities, Morsnet's heart thumped somewhere in the darkness of a mine shaft. The administration was just as strange as the status. Commissioners from neighboring powers stood over the territory, while a mayor operated locally. The laws largely continued to rest on the Napoleonic legacy. There was no proper court of its own, so justice resembled a visiting theatrical performance. Judges from neighboring legal systems would come to settle cases in a territory that didn't quite belong to them entirely. Imagine a courtroom where the walls, the table, the chair, and the defendant are all in a neutral zone, while the logic itself enters through the door on a foreign passport. The place looks as though Kafka had decided to open a legal sanatorium for tired boarders. At the same time, life in Morsnet had its advantages. Taxes were low, customs duties mild, prices attractive, and the very neutrality created the feeling of a small gap between large states. People came here to work, to live, to avoid certain obligations, to make use of the peculiarities of the status. The population grew from a few hundred people to several thousand. Post, money, schools, police, services, everything had to be arranged through neighbors, compromises, and habit. This was a territory where a person could wake up in the morning and not quite clearly answer the question of which country was responsible for their bureaucratic fatigue. The absurdity manifested itself with particular sharpness in the question of citizenship and duties. The residents of Morsnet found themselves between systems, like passengers who seemed to have bought a ticket, but whose train, platform, and timetable all belonged to different companies. For part of its history, the special status allowed avoidance of military conscription, which naturally made the territory attractive to people who had no burning desire to serve as pawns in someone else's military plans. Later, the neighboring states began closing these loopholes for their own citizens. But the very fact is wonderful. A small, neutral strip of land became a refuge, not because it proclaimed great humanist ideals, but because the bureaucratic machinery had temporarily failed to fasten its own seatbelt. On the map, Morsnet was even stranger. After Belgian independence, a near-fantastical point appeared near its northern tip, where the Netherlands, Belgium, Prussia, and neutral Morsnet all converged. That is, not just a tri-point of the kind we've come to see as a tourist attraction, but an almost four-way kiss of sovereignties. Four political entities met so closely that common sense should have placed a bench there and asked for a glass of water. Today, tourists talk about a three-country point, but once upon a time, this place was even stranger. The small neutral wedge turned it into a European four-corners crossroads where the map looked like an error nobody wanted to correct. Travel and historical materials still recall the Valserberg as the former site of this rare border phenomenon. But the most wonderful episode, almost the pearl of our entire collection, was the dream of turning neutral Morsnet into the world's first Esperanto country. When the zinc mine began losing its former significance, the territory needed a new idea, a new legend, a new way of not disappearing into the maw of its neighbors. And here comes Dr. Wilhelm Molly, a physician and enthusiast in whom, judging by everything, lived a rare mix of practical energy and linguistic utopianism. He proposed turning Morsnet into Amiquejo, meaning place of friendship, a small state of an international language, a neutral home for people who dreamed that humanity could be reconciled through grammar. This is no longer just a strange border. This is a plot that seems invented even for a novel. Imagine a small territory between great states, a mine, officials, miners, low taxes, people without a clear national destiny. And suddenly, above all of this, a dream rises. Let's speak Esperanto and become a symbol of world friendship. In another place, that idea would look like a report at the meeting of a very optimistic club. In Morsnet, it had an almost logical beauty. Since the territory couldn't conclusively choose whose it was, why not make it nobody's in the most noble sense? Since the neighbors couldn't agree, why not have the residents agree in an artificial language specially designed for mutual understanding? In the early 20th century, Esperanto supporters really did show interest in Morsnet. Symbols appeared, a hymn, conversations about the future of Amikahio. One can imagine a meeting in Kelmis, a hall, wooden chairs, serious faces, sheets of paper, people pronouncing words of the new language in the hope that they sound like a future world. Outside the windows, ordinary life, mud, mine dust, shops, children, carts. Inside, a utopia, neatly arranged, syllable by syllable. It looked as though Star Trek had accidentally landed in a small European settlement where instead of a space fleet, there was zinc, commissars, and an extremely complicated status. The irony, of course, is merciless. A territory created out of a dispute over a mine had decided to become the capital of friendship. A place born from greed and diplomatic indecision was trying on the role of a laboratory for world harmony. If human history were a play, the audience would laugh nervously at this point. Too beautiful to survive. And indeed, the utopia turned out to be fragile. It wasn't destroyed by a grammatical dispute. It wasn't killed by a shortage of enthusiasm. It was crushed by big history, which rarely asks small projects whether they find it convenient to die. The First World War put an end to the neutral fairy tale. Germany occupied the territory. The neutrality was effectively broken, and after the war, the Treaty of Versailles transferred Morsnet to Belgium. The tiny legal anomaly that had existed for more than a century became the Belgian municipality of Kelmis. From then on, it was no longer a strange condominium, no longer a neutral zone, no longer an almost state, no longer a potential Amikejo. It had become a municipality. The word municipality sounds so mundane that it's almost indecent after all that dreaming, mining, commissars, and foresighted border tricks. But that's often how geographical absurdity ends, not with a bang or fanfare, but with an administrative rename. Today what remains of neutral Morsnet are traces, museum memory, names, roots, old stories, and the feeling that the map here once allowed itself the rare luxury of being officially undecided. A tourist stands at the three-country point, eats a waffle, photographs the signs, laughs, puts one foot here and another there, and may not even suspect that beneath this light attraction lies the story of a territory that was too small for great power glory, but strange enough to outlive many larger states in the imagination. No border horror remains here, no mining state, no Esperanto utopia. What remains is a lesson. Neutral Morsnet is the finest final monument to human inconsistency because it brought together almost all our themes. Like Beer to Wheel, here was a land suspended between states. Like Barla, the border became too detailed and almost domestic. Like the Venbahn, industrial infrastructure and resources suddenly turned into a geopolitical problem. Like Pheasant Island, the compromise was graceful and ridiculous in equal measure. Like the fortress at Cologne, legal uncertainty created a particular form of life, but Morsnet added something else to all of this, a utopia, a dream that a small mistake on the map could become a laboratory of friendship. And in that lies its almost tragicomic charm. People couldn't divide a zinc mine, so they created a neutral territory. The territory lived for decades in a state of suspension. Its residents learned to extract benefit from the exception. Utopians tried to turn the exception into an ideal. A great war came and closed the experiment. Belgium put a full stop. History removed the set. And we stand on a hill, seeing not just a meeting point of countries, but a place where Europe once admitted, sometimes a border is not a line, but an unresolved question that sat in a folder for far too long. And with that, our tour of 11 strange borders comes to an end. But the feeling, I hope, remains an uncomfortably invigorating. We saw villages cut up by jurisdictions, deserts that states abandoned, enclaves where the road to a doctor became an international task, rocks, islands, libraries, former railways, towns inside foreign countries, and a micro-territory that dreamed of speaking the language of world friendship. And if after all of this the map seems less reliable to you, then the journey was a success. Because borders are not just lines, they are the traces of fears, greed, compromises, mistakes, hopes, and the human habit of turning any surface of the earth into a document with a signature, a seal, and fine print. And the fine print, as we now know,